Bastian. Chapter 41, appeared like a siren. The raucous melody and merrymaking faded away as Odette ascended to the third floor, where the guest chamber awaited her. Guided by a maid, she stepped inside the room located at the eastern end, and though the darkness obscured her sight, she knew that, in the light of day, the bedroom boasted a stunning panorama of the tranquil lake and lush forest beyond the slope. "I'll manage on my own." She thanked the maid for helping her get dressed and continued to get ready by herself after that, embracing the pleasure of being independent. Her head spun slightly from the effects of alcohol, but she was still able to steady herself. As she removed her wedding ring, she stepped into the bathroom and started running the bath water, its soothing sound echoing through the room. Had she truly been a good wife? A wave of doubt washed over her. The bathtub filled with warm water and Odette allowed herself a moment of reflection. She deeply appreciated Marchioness Demel's kindness and hospitality, which had allowed her to play the part of Mrs. Clauswitz in a much more relaxed environment than usual. She had savored the exquisite food and pleasant conversations, free from the usual need for vigilance and tension. It was a break from the constant battle of wits she faced every day. A sudden thought occurred to her as she struggled to stay awake. Maybe, just maybe, she could find what she was looking for in Bastian's memories. With determination in her eyes, she delved deep into his mind, sifting through the memories like a detective on the hunt for a clue. So she worked, and even helped stealing glances at Bastian, afraid he might notice her distraction and admonish her once again for not doing her duty. Despite his stoic demeanor, she sensed his mood shift slightly, perhaps wondering what was going through her mind. Bastian's warm laughter and soft gazes filled the dining table with light, making Odette feel at ease in his company. As the night drew to a close, it was Bastian who urged Odette to retire to their room, even though he himself had been drinking more than usual. "Good night, Odette." As Odette climbed the stairs, she could still hear the echoes of Bastian's voice. When she caught his eye, she wondered if his sweet greeting was merely an act. But his smile was genuine, and there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. Odette sighed in relief when she came to a rough conclusion and shut off the water. She then noticed a large window that spanned the entire wall past the bathtub. She glanced through the window with a confused head as she walked over to close the curtains. The night sky above was a dazzling display of twinkling stars, like a vast ocean above her head. With a sudden impulse, Odette flung open the window, drawn by the mesmerizing beauty of the midsummer night. The Milky Way arched above, accompanied by the rustling whispers of trees and the symphony of insects. The reason for the large bathroom window finally became clear to her. Odette was enthralled by the enchanting scene for a long while, until she turned away, leaving the window open behind her. With the room dimmed, she shed her gown, ready to slip into the inviting waters of the bathtub. The ripples ceased, and the bathroom went silent once again. Middle. The haunting howls of coyotes echoed through the dark expanse of the black forest, their calls piercing the stillness of the night. Bastian halted in his steps and gazed out the window in the hallway, where clusters of stars twinkled in the moonless sky. Memories flooded his mind as he reminisced about the special classes held during nights like these, when the family trained to prepare for unforeseen circumstances and groom a capable successor to lead them into the future. In the world of immunity receiving teachers, cruelty was the norm. Yet, a few were exceptions, and their kind-heartedness and deep thinking were rare commodities. Unfortunately, such teachers seldom lasted long. Bastian's longest-standing teacher was a retired army officer stripped of his rank for his cruel treatment of soldiers. However, to Bastian's father, he was a great mentor. After tearing his gaze away from the dim horizon, Bastian continued on his way. Although he was heavily intoxicated, his judgment remained unimpaired. The invitation to Admiral Demel's party was always accompanied by the promise of overflowing glasses and bottomless bottles, and Bastian had often succumbed to the temptations of the night. But tonight was different. Tonight, he chose a different path, one that did not lead him to the bottom of the bottle. He knew that just the right amount of alcohol would lull him into a peaceful slumber, and so he drank enough to take the edge off. As he made his way to his room, a strange sensation crept up his spine. Had Odette already gone to bed? He hesitated for a moment before quietly pushing open the door. The lamp on the bedside table cast a warm glow over the empty bed, signaling to him that she was not there. But as he stood there, a sweet melody reached his ears, drawing him in like a siren's call. The sound, a gentle hum, echoed through the darkness like a lullaby. Bastian followed it, his body moving of its own accord, until he stood before the half-open bathroom door. Without a second thought, he flung the door open, revealing Odette in all her glory. In a mesmerizing moment, Bastian realized the source of the haunting melody was none other than Odette. Her enchanting voice echoed through the room like a spell, casting him under its spell. As he stood frozen in place, he gazed upon the breathtaking sight of her, submerged in the bath by the window. She appeared like a siren, tempting him to join her in the cool, clear water. Her song was like a dream, lulling him into a trance. In the darkness, her naked form shone like a beacon, her vulnerability exposed for all to see. Lost in the moment, she remained oblivious to his presence. Bastian fought back a sudden surge of unease and a feeling of hollowness, balling his hands into fists. And just as he did, a gust of wind swept through the trees beyond the dark forest, causing the leaves to rustle and creating a wave of sound that shattered the silence of the night. Odette abruptly stopped singing and turned her head, following the direction of the wind. Her eyes locked onto Bastian's, and in that moment, the transparent darkness of the midsummer night seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them. But then, fear flashed across her face, and she stared at him blankly. A sharp scream threatened to escape her lips, but Bastian acted quickly, intuited the crisis, and moved to prevent it. With lightning-fast reflexes, Bastian launched himself towards the bathtub and clamped his hand over Odette's mouth to stifle her scream. Despite her feeble attempts to resist, his strength easily subdued her. The silence of the midsummer night was restored as the wind that had shaken the forest gradually died down. Bastian's heart raced as he strained to hear any sign of movement outside the bathroom door. The muffled chatter and laughter of the partygoers slowly faded away, indicating that the night's festivities had finally come to an end. With a relieved sigh, Bastian turned his attention back to Odette, who was now visibly shaken and as pale as a ghost. It was hard for him to reconcile this vulnerable, frightened woman with the bold and bewitching creature he had encountered just moments before. His eyes searched for any sign of understanding from her, trying to make sense of the bizarre occurrence. His grip remained firm, ready to act swiftly in case of any sudden movements or surprises. Odette's body quivered under Bastian's touch, her resistance growing stronger as his gaze trailed down her slender neck, tracing the path of blue veins and down to her clavicle. The drops of water on her heaving chest glistened in the soft light, falling into the still water with a gentle plink. As the noises of the partygoers faded away, Bastian lifted his gaze from her body. Shh! Bastian gestured to be quiet, placing a finger over his lips. Odette's eyes widened with fear, but she obediently nodded. Bastian released his grip on Odette and rose to his feet. With a quick motion, he tossed a towel towards the trembling woman, who eagerly snatched it up and wrapped it around her shivering form. Odette's breaths came in rapid gasps, as if she had just narrowly escaped some great danger. "What brought you here? Why?" Odette struggled to breathe and stuttered over her words. Bastian greeted her eyes with clear, bewildered eyes, and he soon understood the situation. "Did you truly believe this room was meant for you alone?" His frustration was tangible, evident in the way he licked his parched lips and let out an exasperated laugh. "Originally, Why don't we inform Admiral Demel, the Emperor's confidant, right away?" Bastian's voice cut through the air. "Dear Your Grace. You see, our marriage is a charade. We are merely playing the roles of a married couple, and we don't even share a bed. It would be greatly appreciated if we could have another room, separate from each other. Could that be arranged?" "I'm sorry," Odette's voice trembled as she spoke. "I had hoped that you would find a solution to our problem, but I was wrong." Her voice laced with tears and barely audible in the darkness. Her hand shook as she reached up to wipe her flushed face, as if trying to snap out of her daze, but it seemed to have little effect. "Clean up and come out." Bastian exited the bathroom and shut the door behind him, finally catching sight of his own disheveled, damp appearance. After hastily patting himself dry, he stepped out onto the balcony for a smoke. As he exhaled a cloud of white smoke, his gaze drifted downwards and he realized that his arousal had not yet abated. With a wry laugh, Bastian released another plume of smoke and let out a mix of a sigh and a curse. Bastian. Chapter 42, A Cunning and Ruthless Victor. A melody of nature resonated through the air as the trees rustled and swayed to the rhythm of the wind. Odette's eyes fluttered up and her chest jumped up and down quickly as she emerged from the depths of her dreadful nightmares. She wasn't aware of her surroundings or where she was till the sleepiness subsided for a short while. Her lips parted with a gentle exhale, a quiet admission of her unintended slumber. She shifted her gaze towards the bed on the opposite end of the darkened room. She found Bastian lying, still and serene, in the same supine posture as before. Odette released the tension that had held her captive, rising from her chair with a hushed step. With a soft touch, she drew the curtains closed, cutting off the intrusive moonlight. She swiveled on her heel, her eyes drawn to the clock that loomed on the wall opposite. The hand seemed to have crawled across the face of time at a glacial pace, and despite the seemingly endless wait, it was still the dead of night. A few more moments of patience were required before the world awoke from its slumber. Odette's eyes remained fixated on the deserted expanse of the left side of the bed, her heart thrumming with unease. Though it had been allotted to her by Bastian, the thought of invading his space was daunting, leaving it a hollow shell of what it could be. Bastian's composure remained unchanged as he finished his nightly routine, slipping into bed without sparing even a single glance in her direction. She felt like a prisoner, trapped and isolated within the confines of their shared space. As though he had erased her very existence, leaving behind only a ghostly apparition of a fake so-called wife. Bastian, unpredictably, refused to acknowledge it as a trouble. Determined to banish her doubts, Odette steeled herself and approached the bed. The dawn was luxuriously chilly, even amidst the sweltering heat of summer in the mountainous region. She chided herself for lingering in fear, especially when she had the luxury of a safe haven to rest in. It was pointless to fret and stew over the mistake that had already been made. Perhaps she should take a page out of Bastian's book and be bold in her actions. Odette worked up the confidence to sit on the side of the bed, determined to forget everything at this moment. Thankfully, Bastian did not awaken. Even while sleeping, he was charming. His forehead was covered in golden thread-like hair, and his eyelashes were long and straight. He had an old scar below his collarbone. Her scrutinizing gaze locked onto his hand, lingering on the glittering platinum ring that rested upon his chest. It was the emblem of their fraudulent marriage, a stark reminder of the deceit that they had woven. Overwhelmed with a sudden wave of shame, Odette recoiled and fled from the bed as if running from a nightmare. Her hands, adorned with the same ring as Bastian's, felt foreign and heavy as she buried them behind her back. It was akin to the feeling she had experienced years ago, on a bright spring day when she had first set out to peddle her wares of delicate lace. The memories flooded back with unwelcome clarity, threatening to swallow her whole. Middle. Bastian stirred just as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, heralding the start of a new day. Regardless of when he had turned in for the night, he awoke with the same unwavering consistency each morning. It was a routine that had been honed and refined over the years. Without a moment's hesitation, Bastian rose from his slumber as the grogginess dissipated, his eyes scanning the empty expanse of the bed beside him. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Odette was not there. Bastian delicately shut his eyes and then swiftly opened them, hastily rising from the bed. The seat where Odette had perched just the night before remained unoccupied. The seething fury that had previously consumed him at the mere notion of the woman who had fled from this very room dissipated into nothingness. As he made his way towards the wardrobe to change, he discovered his wife reclined on a lengthy sofa, her face directed towards the fireplace. Odette lay there, enveloped in unfamiliar furniture covers, slumbering in a tightly coiled position. Bastian gazed upon the pathetic sight, feeling a sense of confusion wash over him. Against the coldness of the room, he realized that she had not sought comfort beside the man she held in contempt. The sheer audacity of her pride evoked a laughter from him. Odette. A name that Bastian had known all too well for far too long. He swallowed the bitter taste of it on the tip of his tongue, approaching her reclined figure on the sofa with cautious steps. He knew it was best to rouse her and send her off to bed, but he couldn't help but doubt whether Odette would comply without resistance. With a heavy heart, Bastian let out a low sigh and gradually leaned in closer to his slumbering wife. Just as he began to lift the covers off of her, Odette's eyes flickered open, startling him from his thoughts. "Stay put, don't move," Bastian spoke in a composed tone as he lifted her frigid form. For a moment, Odette gazed at Bastian with hazy eyes before launching into an intense struggle. Though she refrained from screaming, she pushed and writhed with all her might, as if Bastian had committed an unspeakable offense against her. Fortunately, she didn't lack the sense to raise a ruckus. "Calm down." Bastian spoke in a stern tone, but his wife paid no heed. Growing increasingly irritated by her stubbornness and unyielding nature, Bastian clambered over the body of the woman he had just released. With a steely resolve, he grasped her arms and forcefully pinned them down onto the sofa, finally bringing an end to her senseless resistance. Despite trembling with fear, Odette's frigid stare never wavered as she locked eyes with him. "I don't want you here. Get off," she gasped, struggling for breath and issuing a scathing command. Bastian gradually lowered his head, meeting the unwavering gaze of the formidable woman beneath him. It was a sight to behold as her cheeks burned crimson, her hair tousled and her bosom heaving with ragged breaths. "What's so amusing?" Bastian chuckled as he restrained Odette, who was writhing with all her might. Overwhelmed by the sheer might in his power, Odette was struck silent, her lips pursed tightly shut. As his body pressed against hers, it sent shivers down her spine, and his piercing gaze made her feel utterly exposed, as though she were standing naked before him. "Enlighten me. What was it that I intended to do?" Bastian inquired. Despite attempting to lift her legs in lieu of her bound arms, Odette was swiftly overpowered by him. As she wriggled beneath him, she was taken aback by the unfamiliar sensations coursing through her tightly pressed lower body, causing her to shake her head frantically in denial. "I won't do anything that isn't agreed to in the contract," Odette exclaimed vehemently. "You're mistaken, Odette. Despite your reluctance, I am your husband, and that is the essence of our contract. It was you who presented the contract on the premise that our marriage was nothing more than a sham." Odette's voice rose in pitch with each passing word. Despite the hushed silence that pervaded the entire third floor, it was only a matter of time before the guests would awaken. Bastian placed one hand on the sofa's armrests and gently squeezed Odette's hands together. As he gripped her chin with his other hand, a loud moan escaped her mouth. "Please keep your word." With an expression that betrayed her desperation, Odette pleaded with Bastian to honor his commitment. But Bastian's features remained stern and his lips formed a cruel smile. The marriage had to proceed as agreed, that much was clear to him. He had no intention of deviating from their contract. Once his dealings with the Emperor were concluded, he would discard her like a used tissue and move on to bigger and better things. Bastian let out a deep, intense breath as he gripped Odette's chin firmly. Since the day they met, he knew that she was meant to be his, despite the reasons that led to their marriage. Therefore, until the end of their agreement, he had every right to claim what was rightfully his. In his eyes, she was nothing more than a tool, a pawn in his grand scheme. He had given her everything she had, and she owed him everything. If he decided to be cruel and show her no mercy, he had every right to do so. He knew that the concept of favor was fickle and superficial, and he had no intention of being swayed by it. "If you don't move straight away, I'll scream." As the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, Odette felt a wave of panic wash over her. Desperate for a way out, she resorted to making empty threats, hoping to intimidate Bastian into moving. However, little did she know that Bastian was one step ahead of her, fully aware of her intentions. "Give it a try." Bastian responded to Odette's challenge with an arrogant laugh, completely unfazed. As she glared at him with contempt, their distance dwindled to nothing. Before she could even react, she felt his hot breath on her lips and his tongue pushing into her mouth, overwhelming her with a sudden, unexpected desire. Odette fought valiantly, having lost even the little bits of dignity she had been barely preserving. Damn the deal, she thought to herself. She might have screamed for assistance. Whatever she desired, she ought to have. But Odette couldn't even breathe properly, let alone scream. Bastian sucked Odette's lips and twisted his tongue as though trying to take everything away while enclosing her beneath his big, muscular body. The kiss was just like a predator stalking its prey. Intense and passionate. Despite being in a state of distress, Odette summoned all her strength and twisted her body as Bastian was momentarily distracted. With her hands finally freed from bondage, she fiercely pushed him away, landing punches and scratching him. However, even after the fierce confrontation, Bastian remained unmoved. Just as Odette was on the verge of despair and feeling helpless, Bastian's lips suddenly parted from hers. Seizing the moment, she let out a cry of indignation and injustice before delivering a swift slap across his face. Slap. The resounding sound echoing through the room. Odette glared up at him with fury, her hands trembling from the adrenaline. Against the stinging sensation on her lips, she refused to back down. Bastian couldn't help but feel foolish for underestimating her. He leaned back, running his fingers through his hair as he contemplated his mistake. It was clear that he had underestimated the strength and tenacity of his so-called wife. Bastian chuckled, finding the defeated yet determined look on Odette's face amusing. It was refreshing to see her finally embracing the art of strategy, like a true Clauswitz. Despite the unsuccessful attempt to strike him again, Bastian found her tenacity intriguing. It certainly made his job more captivating. Catching the wrist he had grasped at once, Bastian devoured Odette's lips again with even more fury. Much resistance followed, but Bastian eventually lost patience with it. Bastian grabbed hold of Odette's breasts without hesitation, shoving his hand inside her pajamas, which had already rolled up to her waist. His tongue crushed and absorbed Odette's screams and moans. Odette's body trembled as she tried to suppress her cries. Everything was a blur, and she couldn't comprehend what was happening. But amidst the confusion, one thing was crystal clear: Bastian's desire for her. It radiated off him like a palpable force, overpowering and all-consuming. Bastian's hand suddenly crept inside her underpants just as it got too painful to bear. She wasn't aware of what was happening until he began lewdly stroking her inner thighs. Odette was caught off guard, unsure of what to do next, and closed her eyes in shock. She reprimanded herself, trying not to cry, and begged for divine guidance, pleading for clarity of thought. However, the sound of Bastian's lecherous actions continued to increase in volume, making it almost impossible for her to concentrate. Bastian. As Bastian's lips met hers once more, Odette summoned her courage and dared to open her eyes. She was met with the cool, collected gaze of Bastian's piercing blue eyes. Bastian. As the commotion outside the room grew louder, Odette clung onto Bastian's face, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered his name. Their gaze locked onto each other, but the noise from the corridor continued to seep into the room, threatening to disrupt their moment. "Help me out." Odette's voice shook with desperation as she spoke. Despite the fact that he was the one causing her distress, he was still the only one she could turn to for help. "Bastian, please. Help me." She squeezed her eyes shut, struggling to keep her composure amidst the chaos that surrounded them. The noise from outside the door threatened to overwhelm her, but she clung to the hope that Bastian would hear her plea and come to her aid. A boisterous, hearty laugh pierced through the tense silence, sending shivers down her spine. The sound of heavy footsteps followed, indicating the arrival of a large and powerful man. Bastian's response was a mirthful chuckle laced with profanity as he rose to his feet. The room was suddenly illuminated by a stream of sunlight, casting an unflattering light on Odette's disheveled and quivering form. Bastian carelessly threw the furniture covers onto the ground beside Odette, who was still shaking from the recent encounter. He could still smell her arousal on his fingers as he wiped his moist lips, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. He pulled down Odette's gown, which had been pushed up to her waist, and rose from the couch, not bothering to glance at her. As he left, he couldn't help but think about his wife, who had proven to be a cunning and ruthless victor. Bastian. Chapter 43, Leash of Fraudulent Agreement. The visitors split into two separate groups as they approached the forest's entrance. The women and kids traveled down the valley on a lovely excursion with plans to enjoy a delightful picnic, while the men, commanded by Admiral Demel, set off on a fishing expedition to catch some trout. "Exercise caution and be mindful of your steps. We don't want to lead our guests into a treacherous terrain," advised Marquis Demel before venturing into the enchanting birch forest with his entourage. Standing at the far end of the group, Bastian and Odette gave each other a quick glance before dispersing. No special words were exchanged, as usual, only lifeless emotions portrayed their face. "Father." A child's breathless scream shattered the peaceful ambience of the forest path. It was the voice of Count Xander's young daughter, who had let out a piercing cry that reverberated through the woods. The serene ambience of the forest trail was abruptly disrupted by the piercing cry of a breathless child. It was none other than the young daughter of Count Xander's, who had let out an alarming scream that echoed through the woods. Bastian swiveled his head towards the source of the commotion and saw the child, who had become separated from her father, sobbing uncontrollably, as if her entire world had come crashing down. It was common for children to cry and seek comfort, so he wasn't particularly surprised by the sight of Count Xander's running towards his weeping daughter. However, the tender display of affection between father and child was foreign to him, having grown up without experiencing it himself. Count Xanders immediately took charge of the situation, comforting his child with tender care. He held her close, showered her with affectionate kisses, and wiped away her tears with the corner of his sleeve, a heartwarming sight that left Bastian feeling somewhat envious. The child's cries gradually stopped, making it appear as though Count Xander's persuasive words had worked like magic. Her small hands, which had held tenaciously to her father's collar, continued to hold on in an apparent attempt to find solace and certainty. As a hint of embarrassment crept over Count Xander's face, Odette stepped in, bringing a bright ray of hope, who stepped forward with an air of confidence. She deftly plucked a vibrant wildflower and approached the father and daughter with a gentle smile on her lips. As soon as she handed the flower to the child, a sudden burst of joy erupted from within the little one, and she began to wave it back and forth gleefully. In the meantime, Odette gave yet another hidden flower from behind her back, holding it out with grace and elegance. One by one, the flowers kept coming, each one more beautiful than the last, until the entire family was surrounded by a glorious bouquet of wildflowers that seemed to dance and sway to an invisible tune. Count Sanders but felt immensely grateful for Odette's kindness, which had transformed a moment of embarrassment into a dazzling display of beauty and joy magically. Odette kept displaying each vibrant flower, and the child's giggles grew louder and more exuberant, her laughter echoing through the forest like a sweet melody. By the time the last flower was offered, all eyes were fixed on Odette, who became the center of attention. Seizing the opportunity, Odette tenderly embraced Count Sanders' daughter, whose beaming smile revealed a newfound happiness that seemed to have eclipsed her father's absence. After expressing his profound gratitude, Count Sanders bid farewell to the group and returned to his fishing expedition, while Odette and the child made their way back, hand in hand. As they walked, Odette's once icy demeanor melted away, replaced by a gentle smile that radiated warmth and kindness. For a brief moment, the forest was filled with a sense of peace and contentment, as if everything in the world was right and good. Count Sanders approached with an apologetic smile on his face, his eyes skimpy a hint of discomfort. "I apologize for any inconvenience we may have caused you unintentionally," he said. "My daughter is shy and anxious, but it seems she has taken a liking to Mrs. Clauswitz." Bastian nodded in understanding, his lips curving ever so slightly to convey his empathy. He could sense that Count Sanders was a loving father who cared deeply for his daughter, despite his initial reluctance to join the group. As the two men exchanged a brief moment of mutual respect, the forest around them seemed to breathe life, becoming alive with a newfound sense of camaraderie and understanding. They soon came across a rocky byway. At the very end of the trail stood Admiral Demel's fishing location. The road grew steeper and narrower as they ascended higher. The soldiers had no trouble ascending the mountain, but nobles who were unfamiliar with the environment naturally lagged behind. As the lagging guests struggled to keep up, Admiral Demel leaned in and issued a secret order to Bastian. "You must help Count Sanders," he whispered urgently, his eyes betraying a sense of concern. "He has asthma." Bastian turned his head to look at Count Sanders, who had fallen out of rank, wheezing and gasping for breath. Despite his initial hesitation to join the group, it was clear that the Count was in dire need of assistance, and Bastian knew he had to act fast. With a sense of urgency in his step, he rushed over to the Count's side, ready to offer whatever help he could. Bastian began speaking up, concerned. "Then perhaps he shouldn't be forced to climb the mountain," he suggested, eyeing Count Sanders with a worried expression. But Admiral Demel was quick to dismiss his concerns. "His symptoms are not very severe. Besides, he came here for an important purpose, so he won't give up easily." "Another purpose besides fishing?" Bastian wondered what other motives Count Sanders might have had for joining the group, especially if he was willing to risk his health to achieve them. Admiral Demel chuckled and shook his head. "Maxime is not interested in fishing in the slightest. Instead, he has a passion for flowers and grasses. In fact, there is a habitat of rare plants on this mountain that he's hoping to collect samples from. He's quite the character, a really nice guy, but definitely eccentric. We should make sure that Maxime doesn't feel embarrassed during the climb. I'll speak with him to ensure that he won't have to be carried on anyone's back." Despite how awful the assignment was, Bastian was happy to accept it. He complied because he was told to do so. There was no reason to allow other ideas or feelings to influence such a straightforward situation. As Bastian resumed his journey, Count Sanders offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry for the trouble. Shall I lend you a hand with your baggage?" Bastian offered his assistance, but Count Sanders declined the offer with a wave of his hand. "No need, it's not that heavy. Your company is more than enough." And with that, he strode ahead while Bastian adjusted his pace to match his. The two men talked quite briefly as they proceeded down the mountain trail. Count Sanders had a pretty dignified and polished way of speech, in contrast to his reputation as a plant-obsessed weirdo. Politics, the financial market, and sports. Also, he had more than a basic understanding of topics related to men's social abilities. Despite all that, he obviously didn't appear interested in anything at all. "Wait!" Count Sanders screamed out as he was moving along and gazing at the ground. Bastian paused after scowling. Count Sanders hurried over and knelt down at the same instant. He was directly in front of a small patch of grass on the road that Bastian had nearly crushed. With a small shovel in hand and a bag slung over his shoulder, Count Sanders carefully dug up a patch of grass. Despite his otherwise reserved demeanor, his expression betrayed a sense of excitement and triumph as he revealed his discovery. "No matter how much I looked for it, I couldn't find it, but here it is," he exclaimed. "Is this the plant you were searching for?" "No, but it is just as invaluable." Count Sanders delicately removed the dirt from the roots and used a clean paper to wipe them. With great care, he wrapped the grass and packed it. When Bastian arrived at the valley where they planned to go fishing, his goal was completed. Count Sanders graciously thanked everyone and then departed to find the target plant. While he appeared to be fatigued, he would occasionally gasp for air, but even then, his upright stance remained unaltered. Bastian sat on a rock beneath a canopy of large trees. Suddenly he got a feeling of déjà vu. Here was where the water that flowed through the narrow valley began to collect. Why did he feel like he had seen this before? As Bastian's fingers curled around the fishing rod, the answer to a lingering question sprang to mind like a fish leaping out of the water. And with a jolt, he echoed the name Odette, his head swiveling towards some unseen presence. With a steadfast determination, Count Sanders roamed the hillside in search of blades of grass. Along the way, he had traversed a path from apathy towards his fellow beings to a genuine fondness and devotion to things of little practical value. Indeed, Maximin von Sanders bore a striking resemblance to his beloved wife, Odette, a fact not lost on those who knew them both. Bastian's eyes fluttered open when the image of Odette lying on the sofa with the furniture covers draped over her filled his mind. But what caught his attention were the blindingly dark green eyes that stared back at him, as if daring him to relive the memories that haunted him. Memories flooded in, the feeling of filth that had washed over him as he looked down at her, the tingling sensation that still lingered even now. But he refused to let them consume him. He then hurled the fishing line out into the water, as if casting away the thoughts that threatened to drag him under. The valley was filled with the sound of unrelenting river flow and wind rustling through the trees. His pointless recollections quickly vanished after that enlivening event. Middle. Can you believe it? Marchioness de Mel scoffed, her tone laced with disbelief. He claimed he was weary of the water, yet he up and moves to a villa nestled deep in the mountains, where he spends his days fishing and boating. The man hasn't the slightest clue what he truly wants. She shook her head, her expression a mixture of exasperation and amusement. It's a wonder he hasn't driven himself mad with all this indecisiveness. When the words of criticism for her husband spilled from her lips, the Marchioness de Mel's countenance remained awash with deep-seated affection. This was a familiar sight, as even the most esteemed ladies of the court engaged in verbal skirmishes over the shortcomings of their own spouses. Odette, meanwhile, found solace in the pleasant chatter as she cradled the child in her arms, offering soothing comfort. While Alma struggled to keep her eyes open, eager to continue playing, she eventually succumbed to slumber's embrace. Mrs. Clauswitz possesses a remarkable gift for tending to children. "It's evident that you have the makings of a fine mother," remarked one of the noble ladies, causing the attention of the group to shift suddenly towards Odette. The earlier tales of marital discord and discontentment paled in comparison to the prospect of discussing motherhood and child-rearing skills. "Let's pause here and take a breather." "Please, go ahead," Marchioness de Mel gestured, prompting the nanny who had been waiting nearby to approach. Odette handed the baby over, not being able to hold on any longer, while the noble women were having tea while sitting by the ravine. "Lady Clauswitz and her husband are both wonderful individuals, and I'm sure they will bring a beautiful child into this world," one of the lady commented with a warm smile. "My husband is already vying to be the godfather of the Clauswitz's unborn child. It's quite embarrassing, really," another noble lady added with a chuckle. "As for me, I shall make room for the grandparents of the child-to-be. Both my son and daughter-in-law are eagerly anticipating parenthood, Mrs. Clauswitz," someone chimed in. The playful jabs directed at the new bride were met with raucous laughter from the group. Odette's head hung low, an awkward smile playing across her lips. The words of praise she had received had been delivered with such ease, yet they left her feeling self-conscious. Was it due to that regrettable incident? Desperate for respite, Odette left the uncomfortable scene and wandered over to a group of young wives frolicking in the water. Unconsciously, she began to make her way up the valley in search of a quiet spot. But the more she tried to push the memory aside, the more it nagged at her. Questions about the man she couldn't quite comprehend flooded her mind, refusing to be ignored. Odette ventured deeper into the wilderness and the distant murmur of human voices faded into silence. Gasping for air, she collapsed onto a flat rock overlooking a breathtaking valley, her heart pounding with the thrill of quest. But her exhilaration was short-lived, as she was forced to endure the vicious insults of a man who treated her like a mere possession, bought and sold at an exorbitant price. Despite her compliance, she seethed with a fiery indignation, vowing to never forget the injustice done to her. Finally, as she rubbed her lips in frustration, she realized that her rage would not be quenched until she had exacted her revenge on the callous, unscrupulous man who had betrayed her trust. Despite the turmoil raging within her, Odette bore her anguish in silence, knowing deep down that Bastian's words held a painful truth. Their relationship was a farce, a mere charade of meaningless transactions and empty promises. But as she pondered the broken promises and heartless betrayal, a flicker of anger ignited within her. Why was he so brazenly defying his own word, and treating her with such disdain? Odette rubbed her lips, trying to erase the memory of his treachery like a stubborn stain. Yet, the more she tried to forget, the more the feeling of inexpressible contempt grew within her, fueling her determination to seek retribution for the hurt he had caused. On the evening of the dinner party, Sandrine said young men craved that sort of pleasure. Even the way she spoke with fake sympathy and the way her eyes treated her like a prostitute selling her body. Odette remembered everything vividly at that very moment. There she is. The courtesan. Odette's heart sank as she heard the cruel words uttered by Princess Isabel ringing in her memory. Though her words had been skillfully cloaked in clever guise, the message had been clear: she was nothing more than a mere courtesan, an object to be used and discarded at the whim of the nobility. When her lips began to tremble ever so slightly, Odette strained them in an attempt to suppress the feeling. Although it wasn't the first time she experienced this, she felt more wretched than she had the first time, for reasons unknown to her. In an act of frustration, she hurled her foolish thoughts away, tossing them into the void alongside a fallen pine cone. And as acorns and pebbles followed suit, she wondered if this symbolic act would bring her any sort of relief. Odette got down and cleansed her face after the water's ripples stopped. Her awareness became more distinct, possibly as a result of the cooling of the heat on her cheeks. Perhaps that was a wise move. With her breathing finally steady, she sauntered towards the valley's abundant flora, her steps now much lighter than before. Though it would have been easy to simply claim she was gathering flowers, Odette felt no need to make excuses for her wandering. Blue irises and golden seaweed bloomed alongside white briar and vibrant wild roses. But it was the sight of a cluster of bellflowers on the far end of the valley that truly caught her attention. It was a bloom she longed to share with the child, and so she made her way towards it with a sense of purpose. With no faint trace of hesitation, Odette swiftly shed her shoes and stockings before gathering the hem of her skirt and pulling it up to her knees. Despite the sweltering heat of midsummer, the water flowing through the valley was frigid, akin to a frozen glacier. Yet, the cold was far from intolerable, and Odette found herself totally unbothered. Odette carefully stepped into a shallow area of the water. When she got to the center of the stream, she heard what sounded like something dropping. As soon as she realized the lock had been tampered with, she wasted no time diving beneath the surface in search of her prized possession. A wave of relief washed over her as she spotted the necklace adorned with a stunning rose crystal pendant, resting just a short distance away. However, before she could even take a step towards it, a figure emerged from the water, snatching the necklace up with a swift motion. With wide, startled eyes, Odette looked on as her supposed spouse, Bastian, stood before her, holding her leash under the guise of their fraudulent agreement. Bastian. Chapter 44, Like a Flower in the Current. Bastian's eyes stole a captivating sight when descended down the trail towards the valley. He saw a beautiful woman stood knee-deep in the rippling waters of the ravine, drawing his attention away from his intended destination. He pondered what she could be doing there, completely unaware of everything around her. Little did he know, it was none other than Odette, the enigmatic woman soon to enthrall his every thought and imaginations. Like a jolting force beyond his control, Bastian's eyes darted and his feet carried him forward, leading him straight to her mesmerizing gaze. His feeble attempted to resist, but he found himself standing before her in a state of complete surrender. At the meantime, he deeply felt a sense of foolishness, realizing how powerless he truly was in the face of her captivating presence. As their eyes locked, he saw her fingers quivering, betraying the facade of composure she had so expertly crafted. The gentle breeze had ceased its playful dance, yet the delicate petals of her untamed floral collection continued to sway and sink. Clutching her skirt in her other hand, Odette stood poised, searching for something valuable in the distance. Bastian felt mixture of amusement and annoyance at the sight of his wife trembling as if anticipating an imminent attack from untamed creatures. As soon as he approached the edge of the valley, the gentle murmur of the nearby stream filled his ears. But his attention was quickly diverted as he caught sight of Odette frozen in a moment of panic. With her delicate form delicately balanced over the glistening stream, her eyes were fixated on something that had slipped from her grasp. Without a second thought, Bastian plunged into the refreshing waters with a powerful splash. The cool liquid enveloped his body, invigorating his senses as he scanned the depths for any sign of Odette's lost treasure. But his sharp eyes quickly locked onto the shining beacon that had eluded her, a breathtaking rose-colored gem that seemed to glow with its own radiance. "Hey there, Captain Clauswitz. It seems you couldn't wait for the fish to bite, and decided to reel yourself in for the day and run to your lovely wife," quipped Admiral Demel, his boisterous laughter echoing through the forest. The sound of raucous merriment carried up the winding hiking trail, heralding the arrival of Demel and his entourage of high-ranking Navy officials. With a brief silent bow in response, Bastian moved towards his stiff wife. He considered giving the necklace back to her and walking away, but it didn't seem like a wise move at the time. "Be cautious, for there are many eyes upon us," cautioned Bastian, his voice a low and urgent murmur as he leaned in towards Odette. She recoiled in surprise, startled by his sudden proximity and the gravity of his words. Odette found herself trapped in a binding contract, and Bastian knew all too well that escape was not an option, no matter the consequences, even if he were to break all his promises. She stood at the edge of a precarious precipice, torn between the drive to secure the financial guarantee promised to her and the overwhelming sense of duty and responsibility she felt towards her own life. The stakes were high, and the slightest misstep could spell disaster. Though the temptation to cause a commotion and flee was great, Odette refused to succumb to the irrational urge. Her attachment to life and the weight of her responsibility were too strong, and she knew that only by standing firm and facing her fears could she emerge victorious from this perilous situation. With a gentle touch, Bastian clasped the necklace around her neck, the open locking ring glittering in the soft light. Despite the fear and antipathy that she conveyed, his will was unshakable, and her emotions were not a factor to be considered. For in this marriage, the dominant force was him, the powerful one who did as he pleased. And in exercising his right to rule, he showed no mercy, for he was beholden only to his own desires. As the silly jokes and laughter of onlookers drifted on the cool breeze, Bastian reveled in his triumph, savoring the sense of control that he held over his wife. Odette was filled with a sense of overwhelming despair as she struggled to endure this unbearable moment. Despite her best efforts to resist, all she could manage was a resentful glare towards Bastian, whose face betrayed neither guilt nor remorse for his past outrageous actions. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, devoid of any hint of emotion or feeling. They seemed to bore into her soul, rendering her powerless and helpless to resist his unyielding will. Just as Odette felt as though she could no longer bear the intensity of Bastian's unwavering gaze, the locking ring on the necklace finally snapped into place, releasing her from the torturous ordeal. With a sigh of relief, she gasped for breath, her body trembling with the weight of the moment. But as she struggled to regain her composure, another group of guests suddenly appeared on the trail, disrupting the fragile peace that had settled upon them. And in that moment of chaos, Bastian's hand slowly swept down the nape of her neck, tracing the contours of her skin until it found the pendant where her heart beat fiercely. Overcome with a sudden surge of emotion, Odette pushed Bastian away with all her might, unable to bear the intensity of his touch any longer. When the wind picked up, the wildflower bouquet slipped from her grasp, its delicate petals scattering across the flowing stream. Her skirt fluttered in the gusts, threatening to drag her off balance and send her tumbling into the icy waters below. But Bastian remained unmoved, a pillar of unyielding strength amidst the tempestuous currents. Only Odette faltered, her footing slipping beneath her as she stumbled towards the brink of disaster. In that moment of crisis, his sturdy arms wrapped around her back, holding her fast and saving her from the ignominy of a humiliating plunge. Yet even as she clung to him for support, Odette wondered if his intrusion was a blessing or a curse. Oh! Odette watched with despair as the bouquet of flowers was carried away by the water's current. The surface of the water sparkled with a myriad of colors as the carefully collected flowers danced and twirled in the gentle current. Odette watched, transfixed, as they swirled and eddied, each one a fleeting vision of beauty. But as the last flower disappeared from view, she was left staring blankly across the stream, lost in thought. Beside her, Bastian's gaze was also fixed on the water's edge, his arms wrapped tightly around her in a protective embrace. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. In the days that followed, Odette often found herself returning to that fateful day, etched in her memory like a vivid dream. The afternoon sun had cast its warm glow over the summer forest, the sound of rushing water filling her ears with its endless song. Amidst the vibrant colors of the flowers and the crystalline clarity of the water, she had felt a sense of peace and wonder that she had never known before. But as the memory faded, one thing remained clear: Bastian, the enigmatic man who had left an indelible mark on her soul. This misunderstanding would eventually pass away to the other side of life, just like the flowers that had floated away in the river. Odette was enveloped by a sense of familiarity and comfort when she suddenly opened the door to her small study. This was her only sanctuary, a place where she could escape from the chaos of the reality life and find solace in her work. The interior decoration of the room was a evidence to her refined tastes and Sandrine's careful attention to detail. Completed just a week after her return from the Demels residence, it was adorned with classical landscape paintings and delicate pilia ornaments, reflecting Sandrine's request to some extent. Seated at her desk, facing the painting she had personally selected, Odette delved into the head maid's work report. As she pored over the details of the household's affairs, she found peace and solace in the familiar routine of her work. And though the world outside may have been in turmoil, she knew that she had a space to retreat, a refuge from the storm and hurricanes. With the dwindling number of guests, Erdine's daily life became increasingly monotonous. Save for the weekends when Bastian came to visit, she spent most of her time alone in the villa, immersed in the routine of her work and the quiet solitude of her thought. Occasional visits from her relatives provided a fleeting break from the tedium, but they were few and far between. Outings were kept to a minimum, a decision that she had made in a moment of lucidity, realizing that contact with the outside world should be reduced as much as possible. 2 months had already passed since the wedding, and soon the short summer of Berg would come to an end, giving way to the cool, windy season. With each passing day, the inexorable march of time carried them forward towards an uncertain future. And though the next summer would surely come, and the summer after that, she knew that their marriage was not meant to last. Odette recognized that 2 years might not be all that long, and she became a little more careful. It was now time for her to take care of herself because the amicable newlyweds had had enough of being treated rudely. To lessen the effects of their divorce, it was the correct thing to do. "The furniture for the solarium will be arriving this afternoon," the maid reported. "Excellent work, Dora. You may take a break now." Odette smiled kindly and acknowledged the report, giving the maid permission to rest and recharge. As the maid stepped back, Odette turned her attention to the stack of mail on her desk, her eyes falling upon a letter from Tara. While sipping her tea, she read Tara's letter with rapt attention. The pages were filled with news of new friends, current interests, and the exciting expectations for the new semester that was about to begin. It was a very Tara-like letter, full of energy and enthusiasm, and it brought a smile to Odette's face. But as she finished reading, her thoughts turned to a more pressing matter. Would Bastian agree to her request to visit her sister for a day? Odette pondered for a few moments, her pen poised over the open notebook. "Let's try to avoid bumping into each other," she wrote down. When she made her way back from a weekend at the Demels, she knew that a difficult decision lay ahead. With a heavy heart, she resolved to keep herself safe by avoiding any conflict with Bastian, no matter the cost. For she had learned the hard way that it was when their paths crossed that the tension between them reached its breaking point. And though Bastian could be a man of few emotions, his wrath was a fearsome thing to behold, leaving Odette shaken and alone in its way. Yet even as she struggled to come to terms with the reality of her situation, she knew that they could continue on as polite strangers, bound together by the tenuous thread of their marriage. They had to spend one more night in the Demels villa, but nothing bad happened like it had the day before. Bastian, who had spent the entire night playing cards and hadn't entered the bedroom until just before morning, is to blame. Odette gave her husband the bed and then left for the early morning walk she'd promised Marchioness Demel the day before. It was a respectful, natural outing. There was no difference between the 2 weekends they spent together in the Ardennes. Odette welcomed her husband with a stunning display that belonged on the opera house stage. Without a single idea or judgment in her head, she simply laughed while sitting motionless. Resentment occasionally crept in, the memory her being almost raped flooded back, but Odette handled it admirably. She would rather suffer disgrace than experience that once more. Only one letter remained in the stack of mail by the time the sunshine peeked through the window's open curtains and reached the desk's end. Maxime von Zanders, the charming botanist had sent the letter. Upon learning that Odette was creating a garden for their new mansion, Count Zanders took it upon himself to offer his expertise. With a kind and gentle demeanor, he recommended plants and flowers that would thrive in the unique climate of Ardennes, sharing his knowledge and experience with a generosity that was rare indeed. And though his words were brief, they carried with them a warmth and sincerity that touched her deeply. For in his greeting, she sensed not only a deep gratitude for his kindness to her daughter, but also a genuine concern for her well-being. As Odette stood up, her heart still warmed by the kindness of the letter, she was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected message. New furniture had arrived, and she knew that she must make haste to oversee its placement. Quickly smoothing down her hair and straightening the folds of her skirt, she made her way to the solarium, where the interior decorator awaited her arrival. Together, they worked tirelessly to ensure that each piece was perfectly placed, taking great care to bring out the full beauty and elegance of the room. And as they finished their work, Odette's eyes were drawn to an unexpected surprise, a grand piano, sitting proudly in the center of the hexagonal room, its polished wood and gleaming keys. As Odette gazed at the magnificent piano, her curiosity got the better of her. "Did my husband buy the piano?" she asked. The interior decorator smiled proudly as he opened the lid of the piano, revealing its exquisite interior. "Actually, it was my idea to put a piano in the solarium," he said, a hint of self-satisfaction in his voice. "And your husband was more than happy to agree. But I must say, this is not just any piano. It took a lot of hard work and dedication to get a piece as rare and beautiful as this." Although he was boasting, at least this claim was fairly accurate. Odette saw this at a glance for a person who had been playing the piano for many years. Odette looked at the magnificent piano before her keenly, and wondered. For Bastian, a man who had never shown any interest in music, to have chosen such a luxurious instrument was a mystery that she could not unravel. But even as she pondered the enigma before her, she knew that it was not hers to solve. And then she reminded herself of a simple truth: don't be greedy for what isn't mine. Odette scolded herself for her uncharacteristic greed. Her eyes remained fixed on the beautiful piano before her. Even though she knew that she could never possess such a magnificent instrument, she couldn't cease longing and desiring to play it. Middle. Bastian's departure from work was a welcome relief, coming earlier than he had anticipated. The preparations for the naval festival had been completed. But even as he savored this moment of respite, he couldn't help but feel a sense of resignation and weariness. For he knew his reprieve would be short-lived, and that he would soon have to return to the grindstone once again. "I'll rest for a bit, Lovis." Bastian's command was brief and to the point. With that, he made his way to the study on the second floor. The allotted break was less than 30 minutes, excluding the time he needed to get dressed and walk around. Bastian sank into his plush-wing chair, shedding his uniform jacket with a heavy sigh. Having taken several days off from work in order to complete his urgent business as quickly as possible, he knew that there was still much to be done. And so he worked late into the night, until the wee hours of the morning, before finally returning home to catch a few hours of rest. But even as he closed his eyes and allowed himself to drift off, the insistent ring of the telephone shattered his peace. He could have ignored it, could have let Lovis take the call, but something inside him compelled him to answer. And so he rose from his chair, crossed the room to his desk, and picked up the receiver with a sense of weary resignation. "Yes. This is Bastian Clauswitz." Bastian held the receiver to his ear, the late afternoon sunlight casting a warm glow across his face. He waited patiently for a response, but none came. As he was about to hang up, a voice on the other end spoke up, offering an awkward greeting. Bastian couldn't quite place the voice, but he knew it was someone he had spoken to before. "It's me," the voice said hesitantly. "So?" Bastian sighed, closing his eyes for a moment before looking out the window once more. "I know you, Odette." The strong coffee he had consumed earlier had left him feeling jittery and on edge, but now he felt the sharp edges of his nerves gradually dulling. It was a bittersweet sensation, not entirely unpleasant but also tinged with a sense of languid fatigue. Bastian. Chapter 45, The Perfect Aristocrat. Odette serenely shared her experience of residing in the Ardennes estate, revealing her plans to construct an outbuilding and purchase new furniture and paintings. Moreover, She mentioned the urgent need to respond to the pending invitations, but Bastian only grasped the full extent of Odette's vision upon hearing her discuss the specific flora and fauna to be planted in the outbuilding's garden. I was contacted by the madam. Lovis frequently served as the bearer of news these days, with the madam communicating important matters to Odette via phone, and Lovis subsequently conveying them to him. Bastian now understood why she had never given him a straight call. Because she always made sure to call during his absence in order to avoid having to speak with him. But her strategy failed since Bastian uncannily left for home early today. The piano arrived today, Odette announced. Bastian, who was looking at his watch with a tired expression, responded after a short pause, "Piano?" "Yes, the one for the solarium," Odette said, her voice filled with excitement as she went on to explain how wonderful the instrument was. Bastian struggled to jog his memory, searching for any recollection of a piano delivery, but to no avail. The task of adorning the new home was solely entrusted to the Empire's top interior decorator. His expertise in procuring opulent and costly items was sufficient for Bastian, who was content with simply signing checks for everything. "Why?" Bastian asked with a hint of impatience. Just as the conversation was starting to frustrate him, Odette finally revealed her intention. "Can I use the piano?" "Why are you asking me that?" Bastian countered. "Because it's yours," Odette replied, being cautious and prudent. "If you purchased it with someone else in mind, I won't play it." Bastian sighed in relief as he finally realized who the second person was that his wife had alluded to. He found it strangely amusing that Odette would pay attention to Sandrine. It wasn't an enjoyable feeling, though. "I don't care about it, do whatever you want," Bastian said indifferently. "Ah, okay. Is that a satisfactory answer?" Bastian asked. "Yes, thank you, Bastian," Odette replied, her tone shifting slightly to reveal a hint of excitement despite remaining professional. "I will treat it with care." Bastian," Odette's voice lowering to a whisper. "I was thinking of going to Rat's tomorrow to get some sheet music," she added. "And?" Bastian responded. "Can I? If I said no, would you reconsider going?" Bastian asked. "Unfortunately, yes." "Why?" "Because I don't want to do anything that would upset you," Odette said without hesitation. Bastian's face softened into a helpless smile as he put the phone back in place. His gaze shifted from his watch to the garden outside the window, where golden sunlight was streaming in. The breeze carried a sweet fragrance. The fragrance of golden oaks signaled the farewell of summer. From that day forward, Odette went to great lengths to feign ignorance. Bastian couldn't fathom her motives, but her ruse wasn't very convincing. Nevertheless, he humored her moderately, as he had no inclination to delve into the matter at present. As his father scrambled to reorganize his troops in response to the sudden declaration of war, Bastian too rallied to confront the enemy. The major strategies had been put in place, yet careful coordination was required to counter the adversary's moves. Deception was the key to success in this game of chess. Bastian anticipated a leisurely pace, with ample time to plot his next move. However, an unforeseen twist threw his plans into disarray. Admiral Demel hinted that the Emperor was wary of him and his spouse. The proximity between Ratz and Erdine was not great, and the Emperor found it peculiar for a newlywed couple to be separated. He suggested to quash any gossip before it spread, but it was merely an imperial decree conveyed through Admiral Demel's mouth. Bastian appeared to be under pressure to complete the firm work as soon as possible in order to soothe the uneasy Emperor. "I want to see you tomorrow at 12, come to the Admiralty," Bastian said in a composed tone. "Do you mean we're meeting? I don't like being away for too long, so maybe we can have lunch together." "You don't have to do that, I'll just get the sheet music and return. I'll inform the entrance checkpoint, just mention my name." Bastian stated the situation unambiguously, leaving no room for debate. Admiral Demel acted as the Emperor's eyes and ears, so it wouldn't hurt to demonstrate his unwavering loyalty by following his commands. It was like wagging his tail, proving his allegiance. "All right, then," Odette said, despite her apparent reluctance. "By the way, Bastian, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Well, getting into the Admiralty might be a bit awkward and unfamiliar for me. Would it be possible to change the meeting place? What do you think? How about we meet at the fountain in front of the Admiralty's main entrance instead?" Bastian suggested. After some back and forth, Odette quietly agreed. Tomorrow at 12, at the fountain in front of the Admiralty. After affirming the appointment, Bastian hung up the phone. As he spun around, massaging his tired eyes and temples, the chime of the bell echoed, marking the end of the brief interval. Middle colon middle colon middle. Theodora Clauswitz let out a nervous cry as she drew the curtains, obscuring the once glorious seascape that was a source of pride for the mansion. "This is truly horrible," she exclaimed. "How much longer do we have to endure living like this?" Franz took a break from his book and let out a heavy sigh, lifting his gaze. His mother, a bundle of nerves, was pacing the room, cigarette in hand. Her once poised and elegant demeanor was now marred by a growing dependence on alcohol and nicotine, a result of the torment she's been enduring since Bastian's mansion across the bay was revealed. She no longer carried the grace she once did. "Have faith in father, mother," Franz said, trying to mask his own doubts. "He's determined to find a solution, so I'm sure he'll figure it out soon." "You always act like this tragedy doesn't concern you," Theodora chided. "I'm just trying to keep my worries in check. I'm just as concerned as you are." "Then don't waste your time with those books. Help your father instead. This isn't the time for carelessness." The blame shifted. Franz, feeling disillusioned, put up with his mother's persistent scolding. "Do you think Bastian might be considering marrying the Duke of Felia's daughter after using the daughter of the beggar duke to build connections?" His mother ranted before spiraling into her own fantastical musings. "No matter how crazy he is, he wouldn't do something so heinous to the Emperor's niece, Odette," Franz tried to reassure her. "Odette, the Emperor's niece, may be well-spoken, but she's a weakling with no influence. There's no reason for Bastian to not dispose of her. After all, he's the son of Jeff Clauswitz," Theodora sneered, picking up her cup with the hand that had just put down her cigarette. "I should have put a stop to this before it got this far, instead of caring about appearances. Your father was foolish to think he could raise a monster like Bastian and then just get rid of him. It's a disaster." Theodora gulped down the stabilizer along with the poisonous alcohol and slumped back onto the sofa as if defeated. "By the way, Franz," she started, "it's strange. Everyone thinks Bastian and Odette are madly in love, but the servants say otherwise." "What are you referring to, mother?" "Bastian may visit our den every weekend, but he always stays in a different room," Theodora revealed. "A virile young man like him wouldn't do that if he was truly in love with his wife. And since the Duke of Pelia's daughter can't walk, there's no way she has any physical issues." Franz rose from his seat, his expression stern. The wind blew a book off its place, sending it tumbling across the vibrant patterned carpet, but Theodora paid it no mind, reaching for her cigarette once more. "Mother, did you really conduct such a dirty background check?" "Yes, my dear," Theodora said, her gaze softening as she looked at her son. "May you flourish as a noble flower of our family. I will bear the dirt and grime for you. I devoted my entire life to protecting your father, and I want to make sure that the legacy of that love is safeguarded. You need to understand that. And please, don't disappoint your father. I beg of you." "No matter what I do, father is always ready to be disappointed," Franz replied with a sigh. "The more he continues like this, the harder you'll have to work. Why don't you visit Ella? Your father would be over the moon if you formed an in-law relationship with Count Klein. Make sure to cling to your fiancé. Focus on your job and continue learning. Father devoted his entire life to becoming a noble, but as the heir to a noble family, he's eager to turn me into a merchant." "Franz," Theodora said, approaching her son and sighing deeply. "The world is changing. A nobleman who doesn't have a source of wealth can no longer call himself a nobleman. Just look at Bastian's wife. Despite her noble blood, they live in poverty. But you're different. With your father's estate and my distinguished lineage, you have inherited the perfect combination to be the ideal aristocrat of the new era." "But I..." Franz started to object. Theodora's hand were holding tight to Franz's shoulder, was brimming with intensity as she said, "You can do it. I know you can. Right? Isn't that right?" "Yes, mother." Franz could only offer the one acceptable response, and Theodora beamed with satisfaction before drifting off to sleep. Franz summoned the servants to escort his mother to her bedchamber. As the commotion died down, the sun started its descent. Back in his room, Franz stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the bay and released a deep sigh. In the distance, the silhouette of the mansion across the sea, tinged with the hue of a setting sun, was just barely visible. It was exactly where Odette resided. Franz approached the railing and delicately clasped the small piece of gold foil he had hidden in the depths of his vest pocket. During their fateful encounter at the gallery, they shared tea together, and the eager-to-please gallery owner had presented a spread of cookies and cakes, but Odette only indulged in a single piece of chocolate. In a moment of impulsiveness, Franz had taken its wrapper, feeling both shame and a lack of remorse. What was he doing now? Franz thought of Odette, feeling the gold foil against his fingertips, yearning to gaze upon her face of perfect beauty. He longed to open his heart to her, to love her. By the time his heated breath had subsided, a heavy dusk had descended. After departing from the balcony, Franz retrieved the notebook he had concealed on his desk. It was a collection of art, solely dedicated to portraits of Odette. As he reached the final page, Franz began to sketch Odette once more, the sound of his pencil gliding across the paper filling the room as the darkness deepened. Bastian. Chapter 46, A Long Wait. At the onset of Privet Avenue, stood the Navy Department, an imposing structure at the heart of the city, flanked by the magnificent Prater River and the impressive edifices of the cathedral and government offices. Odette gazed up at the grandiose building, marveling at the golden spire that stretched towards the heavens, crowned with a trident emblem, a symbol of the awe-inspiring might of the sea god. Although she had traversed this locale countless times before, it was only today that her eyes were truly opened to its wonders. With measured breaths, she made her way towards the marble fountain that graced the front of the Admiralty's main entrance. Towering above the fountain's surface were statues of mighty sea gods, their forms a fusion of human and fish, from whose imposing bodies surged powerful jets of water. The fountain's periphery, doubling as a seat, was bustling with individuals biding their time or seeking respite. Amidst the throng of people, Odette found a spot sandwiched between an elderly gentleman engrossed in his paper and a gaggle of schoolgirls in matching uniforms. Positioned to face the Admiralty's entrance, she straightened her attire and cast a glance at her wristwatch, noting that she still had half an hour until the scheduled meeting. Uncertain of whether there was ample time to undertake any other pursuit, she opted to prolong her wait in the present spot. Retrieving a paperback book from her bag, Odette opened its pages, though her thoughts were too muddled to truly engage with the text. Nonetheless, she sought to avoid appearing fidgety and impatient in front of the man she was meeting. The minutes ticked by, with 20 having elapsed already. Odette intermittently riffled through the pages, deliberating on which musical scores to procure. As she perused the options, a niggling sense of doubt crept into her mind, causing her to question whether her abilities had deteriorated significantly. Consequently, she resolved to focus on honing her skills through practice pieces in the interim. The minutes ticked away, with 15 having elapsed thus far. Emerging from beyond the raised drawbridge, a mighty warship sailed into view, drawing the attention of onlookers who hurried towards the river's edge. As the crowds dispersed, a hush fell over the once bustling fountain. Casting a quizzical gaze around her surroundings, Odette soon refocused her attention on the paperback in her hands. It was then that an unwelcome voice rang out, shattering the peace. "Hello, Odette." At the sound of a saccharine and affable voice of Sandrine, Odette lifted her head to meet the anticipated countenance. Concluding her perusal of the book, Odette shut it and rose to her feet. "Greetings, Countess Lennart. It has been some time," she replied evenly and courteously, meeting Sandrine's scrutinizing stare with composure. "It appears that you are awaiting someone at the Admiralty," Sandrine observed, her gaze following the direction of Odette's stare. "Yes, I have a lunch appointment." "Ah, how fortuitous. I, too, am destined for the Admiralty to meet someone. Shall we proceed together?" Sandrine proposed. "No, I shall wait here. This is the designated location for the appointment. Farewell, Countess Lennart," Odette declined with a firm yet polite tone. Following her rejection, she returned to her seat by the fountain. It is disheartening to discover that a lady with imperial lineage from the Berg family, renowned for their impeccable conduct, could exhibit such impolite behavior, Sandrine sneered. Odette faced Sandrine squarely, her hands clasped calmly on her lap, showing no trace of embarrassment. When has it ever been acceptable for an officer's spouse to show discourtesy to a Countess of Berg? If you are the wife of Captain Clauswitz and I am Countess Lennart, then certainly, such behavior would constitute a significant affront. However, I dare say our relationship is somewhat different, Sandrine retorted. Based on your words and actions thus far, it would appear that you do not acknowledge me as Bastian Clauswitz's wife. Rather, you seem to believe that this position is rightfully yours. However, it is not possible for a man to have two wives concurrently, and thus, I have elected to withdraw and grant it to you when the appropriate time arrives. Odette inclined her head slightly as she spoke, with an unyielding gaze fixed on Sandrine. What are you trying to say? I shall revert to my customary decorum and conduct only after relinquishing my position as Mrs. Clauswitz. As you mentioned, I am a noblewoman with royal blood from a ducal family. Therefore, why should I submit to your authority? Replied Odette, her tone unwavering despite the flagrant sophistry she employed. Kindly elucidate your intentions. If you desire me to fulfill the role of an officer's wife, I shall endeavor to do so. I apologize for my previous discourteous behavior towards a lady of elevated status. However, if your intention is to feign being Mrs. Clauswitz in my presence, be prepared for my continued conduct, Odette declared calmly, maintaining her composure as Sandrine appeared taken aback by her words. What if I were to rise and offer an apology? Odette raised her head, her opulent diamond earrings glinting as she spoke. Meanwhile, Sandrine gazed at Odette's audacious countenance, a peculiar smile playing on her lips, even as she noted the brazen act of taking something that belonged to another. It is a rather touching reflection indeed. I suggest that you relax and relish your reading. Indeed, thank you for comprehending. Odette nodded her head before opening her diminutive book that rested on the fountain's edge. Her countenance seemed to dismiss Sandrine's presence altogether, despite the latter still being in close proximity. Silently, Sandrine turned away, electing not to utter another word. The air was suffused with her icy rage and contempt, yet she derived solace from the knowledge that Bastian Clauswitz had not been ensnared by a pretty, vapid imbecile. While such a development could potentially complicate matters, it was preferable to allowing the man to remain unimportant. Seriously, Odette. Sandrine's voice rang out as she abruptly halted at the threshold of the path that led to the Admiralty's main gate. Odette, seated with a straight back and engrossed in her book, gradually lifted her gaze to meet Sandrine's piercing stare. I trust that you have ample reading material at your disposal. The wait may be prolonged, far beyond your expectations, Sandrine advised, offering what appeared to be her final act of kindness. Odette bowed respectfully without uttering a word. She lowered her gaze to resume her perusal of the open book. The sun's laggard rays of late summer bathed the woman in a tranquil glow as she immersed herself in the world of her reading material. The vista that stretched out before her was a breathtaking panorama that seemed to implore the suspension of time. Middle. Sandrine, I'm sorry but Bastian is currently dealing with an emergency, said Lucas firmly. He was aware of Sandrine's intentions when she had called him out of the blue to ask for lunch. Apparently, she had only used the invitation as a ploy to see Bastian. Sandrine's lifeless eyes suddenly betrayed a flicker of emotion. Did something bad happen? Lucas saw the fear in her cousin's eyes. For a moment, he felt defeated and let out a resigned sigh. Despite the annoyance of being used by Sandrine time and time again, Lucas found it difficult to hold a grudge against her. He understood his sister's heart all too well. Her love for Bastian was genuine and Lucas knew this better than anyone. Sandrine had been this way ever since she met Bastian for the first time. Lucas always wondered how Sandrine could give her whole heart to a man who was incapable of loving anyone else. Her love for Bastian was unrequited and misguided, and he had tried to talk her out of it for a while. But at some point, Lucas realized that Sandrine didn't actually want her love to be reciprocated. She seemed content with just possessing Bastian, even if he was only using her in return. It was a very sad situation, with a woman desperate for love and a man who seemed incapable of returning it. The relationship they had was one where neither of them lost. In fact, they were a perfect match for each other. He just got a call from the Imperial Palace. Apparently, there's an urgent matter to discuss regarding the Belov delegation's attendance at the Naval Festival. Admiral Demel needs to meet with His Majesty in person, and he'll be meeting with Bastian. But what about the lunch with Bastian? Asked Sandrine. Lucas let out a frustrated sigh, seeming tired of all the drama. In this situation, there's no time for lunch. They need to rush to the Imperial Palace right away, he explained, frowning. So, let's not waste our time thinking about anything else today. Just you and I can have lunch together in peace. Lucas donned the officer's cap he had been holding and gestured for Sandrine to follow as they made their way out of the headquarters building's lobby. Lucas knew she would have to leave again soon yet. Sandrine had insisted on coming here to see Bastian. He felt a twinge of pity for her as her desperate attempts to catch a glimpse of him had left her in tears. Lucas spun around in a panic upon realizing that he couldn't hear Sandrine's footsteps. "What are you doing?" he asked, puzzled. Sandrine had been lost in thought and staring off into space. "Did Bastian already go to the Imperial Palace?" she asked, her eyes suddenly lighting up with hope. "He hasn't left yet, but he'll probably be on his way soon. Look, there's a black car parked under the stairs of the headquarters building," Lucas replied casually, pointing in its direction. Sandrine looked disappointed. "I'm sorry, Lucas. Let's have lunch another time. I'll treat you to a nice meal to make it up to you." "What's going on? What are you planning to do?" "It's nothing for you to worry about," Sandrine replied, flashing him a knowing smile. With that, she began to make her way toward the central staircase leading to the lobby. Middle. Sandrine stood there, on the stairs, not looking at Bastian even once. Admiral Demel suddenly appeared on the stairs. "Who is this? Isn't that Countess Lennart?" "Hello, Admiral," Sandrine greeted the Admiral with a weak, trembling voice. Admiral Demel looked at her with concern, as expected. "Why are you here?" "I was supposed to have lunch with Captain Abald, but I was about to leave because I suddenly got a headache. I guess with so many things to worry about, this happens often and causes trouble for those around me." Sandrine let out a quiet sigh, her face expressing sadness. Admiral Demel was a man of honor, a true gentleman, the polar opposite of Bastian. He couldn't bear to turn away a lady in distress. "Well then, let's ride together," he offered without hesitation. "Time is running out, so it might be difficult to take you all the way home. However, since the Lennart family's residence is on the way to the Imperial Palace, it's not an inconvenience to drop you off there." Sandrine was grateful for the offer, and at times like this, she was glad for the rumors that surrounded her. Her reputation as a woman abandoned by her husband for another man had proven to be useful. "Lord Demel, you are very kind." "Thank you. I feel a bit shameful, but I appreciate your help," Sandrine replied gratefully, seizing the opportunity without hesitation. She glanced up at Bastian to see any expression, yet he displayed none. Perhaps he had already opened up to his wife about his situation, but it made no difference to Sandrine. Her sole intention was to plant a tiny seed of uncertainty in Odette's mind. And for the time being, that was sufficient. Let Odette take care of nurturing and cultivating that seed. Sandrine strolled past the flabbergasted Lucas and was escorted out of the headquarters lobby by Admiral Demel. Once they descended the steps, the chauffeur sprang into action, opening the door of the waiting vehicle for them. With Admiral Demel and Sandrine securely seated in the back, Bastian settled into the front passenger seat. The ceremonial car then smoothly pulled away from the Admiralty, piloted by its uniformed driver. As Sandrine drove down the long, tree-lined driveway, the main gate with its checkpoint loomed into view. She cast a scrutinizing gaze at the fountain beyond the fence, and despite the considerable distance, she easily spotted the woman who was still on guard duty. The fluttering hem of a sunny yellow chiffon dress caught her eye, swaying in the breeze. There was no mistaking it, that was Odette indeed. Bastian. Chapter 47, May It Pass By Like This. Odette was engrossed in a book as she lounged by the fountain, appearing serene and unaware of the recent cancellation of her appointment. Bastian let out a sigh as the barrier lifted, and the car crept closer to the fountain, passing by the officers standing at attention. The road in front of the naval department forked into three paths that encircled the fountain, and to reach the western road that led to the Imperial Palace, they had to navigate around it. He wished the vehicle would just keep moving. Bastian scribbled a note and entrusted it to the soldier on duty, instructing them to rush it over to Odette. He wanted to ensure it reached her promptly, so she could attend to her own affairs. Perhaps, he thought, it would be a welcome change for the woman. He sighed and tore his gaze away from the car window, just as Odette set down her book. Glancing at her watch, Odette gazed at the main gate of the Admiralty with a composed expression. 20 minutes had already passed since the designated time, and she simply waited in silence, biding her time. Bastian was jolted by a memory of their first official meeting, when she had stoically awaited his arrival despite his intentional lateness. She was his arranged spouse, after all. As the realization that he had, in fact, married the woman washed over him once more, Odette's gaze shifted to the car. But it was a fleeting moment. In no time, the car picked up speed and the distance between it and Odette grew rapidly. Yet, the instant their gazes locked stayed imprinted in Bastian's mind like a brightly lit snapshot. Odette quickly rose from the fountain upon recognizing him, her blank eyes fixated on him. She briefly glanced at the backseat before locking eyes with him once more. Her expression appeared pained, though it was difficult to tell for certain. The car had already turned onto the western road when Bastian pondered this. As he unconsciously relaxed his fists, the car steadily picked up speed. Odette, now a small yellow speck, receded from view as she stood alone by the fountain. The Emperor's directive and his pledge to Odette echoed in his mind. It wasn't a decision that required weighing the pros and cons, and he made the necessary choice. He was aware that he could have paused the car for a moment in front of the fountain to explain the situation, but he didn't. His wife of 2 years simply could not be his top priority. It was only natural. She was a woman who possessed nothing and had nothing to offer. What could she possibly bring to the table for him? Bastian lifted his gaze from his closed eyes to the front mirror with a deep sigh. When their eyes met in the reflection, Sandrine's lips curved into a gentle smile. "How's your headache holding up?" Admiral Demel cautiously interrupted the quiet of the car. "It's still persistent, but thanks to you, it's improved greatly," Sandrine replied, her expression brightening briefly before she let out a weary sigh. She looked like a person on the brink of exhaustion. "Thank you so much. If it weren't for your help, Admiral, I'm sure I would have been suffering for days." "It's my duty," Admiral Demel replied, his eyes filled with genuine concern and the soldier's honor of being chivalrous. He cast a glance at Sandrine. Meanwhile, Bastian, uninterested in the conversation, turned his attention to the Prata River that flowed past the passenger window. As the scorching sun began to set, the world around them became clearer, with sharp outlines emerging. The verdant hues of the roadside trees had dulled, and the water had taken on a deeper hue. An image of Odette, watching the car fade into the distance over a summer landscape past its prime, suddenly flashed through his mind like a light bulb. As the seasons changed and the festivities came to a close, Bastian would be granted permission to head to the front lines. This simple reality banished the annoyance caused by the lingering image of the ineffectual woman. He would soon be departing and, once the agreed-upon period had passed, he would return and address this marriage. In the meantime, she would prove useful by efficiently fulfilling her duties and fading away without any further hassle. With the irrelevant memory banished, Bastian fixed his gaze on the road ahead. He didn't cast a single glance behind him until he had left the Lennart family behind and arrived at the regal gates of the imperial palace. Middle. The rustling of leaves in the breeze created a melodic counterpoint to the tranquil gurgle of the fountain. With slow, deliberate movements, Odette tore open the envelope amidst the invigorating commotion. Her skirt, adorned with layers of chiffon, was in disarray, much like her current emotional state. The brief note from Bastian read, "I have a pressing issue to attend to, so I must reschedule our meal for another time." Just one line of inconsiderate notice. She read the note over and over again before neatly folding it and tucking it away in her handbag. The river breeze died down, and the shadows cast by the swaying tree branches above her head grew still. The young soldier, who was on errand duty, continued to stand guard and kept a close eye on her expression. "Thank you," Odette said with a soft smile, "you may go now." The soldier, his cheeks flushing, quickly lowered his head in a bow before spinning on his heel and rushing away. As the soldier's figure vanished behind the barriers of the Admiralty, Odette released the quiet sigh that had been pent up within her. She fully comprehended Bastian's circumstances. The sight of him departing with Admiral Demel in a military vehicle made it evident that he was conducting official business. The presence of Sandrine was irksome, but Odette knew it was not a matter she could intervene in. Sandrine held a greater significance in his heart than his wife ever could, a fact he had made evident from the very moment he broached the topic of marriage. But to say he proposed would suggest an ongoing connection between them after their weddings, a connection he had no intention of fostering. Odette tore her gaze away from the road's vanishing point and made a decision. She would purge the memory of Bastian from her mind, for he had callously ignored his waiting wife and was now consumed by regret. Though Odette was aware of everything, she still chose to go through with the marriage. She refused to second-guess herself now or to lay blame on Bastian. After all, it was a sham of a union, a mere transaction that would benefit them both. With her mind made up, Odette departed from the fountain, dissolving regrets within her heart. It didn't take her long to traverse from the Admiralty to the bustling heart of downtown. Odette thought the entire time she was alone, strolling down the street, that it was actually lovely not to have to be with the bothersome man. The same held true as she leisurely strolled the mall, selected some sheet music, and went to the outdoor cafe. "Is there anyone accompanying you?" the manager asked, repeating the same question as before. "No, I'm alone," replied Odette, her response unchanged from the previous occasion. With kindness, the manager led her to a charming terrace that offered a picturesque view. As she settled at the table, memories flooded back, This was the very spot where she had shared an unexpected tea with Bastian. The manager, having set aside the menu, looked concernedly at Odette's expression. Is everything okay? Are you experiencing any inconvenience? Odette smiled and shook her head. No, I'm all right. Although it was an unpleasant coincidence, she didn't feel the need to switch seats over it. After indulging in a coffee and cake treat, Odette took a moment to bask in the breathtaking scenery along the Prater River. The tranquil waters glimmered with the dazzling afternoon sun, painting a serene picture. Just then, a tap on her table brought her thoughts to a man who embodied the same radiant glow. Odette, who realized it couldn't be Bastian, glanced up in shock. Even more profound and icy disillusionment overcame her when she noticed a strange man standing there. Greetings. It appears you're alone. A man donned in a vintage infantry officer's uniform flashed a warm, sugary smile. Would the lovely lady permit me the privilege of treating her to a cup of tea to fight her loneliness? With a gaze that betrayed his true motive, he cast a look at the unoccupied seat across from Odette. He was a typical city rogue who relished in the thrill of wooing single women in his leisure. This type was all too familiar to Odette, having encountered it multiple times in the past. My spouse will be arriving shortly, Odette replied firmly yet gently, emphasizing her point by placing her glittering wedding ring on the table. I apologize, the man said, his face flushing with embarrassment, before scurrying off. Odette let out a soft sigh as she gazed at her husband's vacant seat. She was grateful to have escaped the situation, but at the same time, her heart ached with sadness. In a moment like this, the only person she could rely on was her faux spouse. The irony of it all was both poignant and comical. Has that pressing matter been taken care of by now? Odette pondered aimlessly, absent-mindedly flipping through the sheet music she had acquired earlier. No doubt he's with Countess Lennart, her heart whispered. As she reached a casual conclusion, a waiter carrying a tray approached her table. Gathering the sheet music that failed to capture her attention, Odette sat up straight and gazed at her wedding band. The table fell into silence once more as the waiter finished his duties and disappeared. After taking a moment to catch her breath and carefully centering a vase containing a single rose on the table, Odette indulged in her own private tea time. The Prater River, with its glistening waves of gold, provided a stunning backdrop as she savored every sip of her coffee and every bite of her delectable cake. Despite the peacefulness of the moment, Odette's attention was solely focused on tidying up the teacups and plates, almost as if it were a task she had been assigned. In her fervor, she forgot all about the empty chair opposite her, once reserved for her husband who would never again join her for tea. Deciding not to dwell on what couldn't be hers, she found solace in the idea that having no regrets was the best outcome. As she had learned from the countless losses she endured in her past, the pain of parting ways would be commensurate with the magnitude of the love she had given. And so, armed with this knowledge, she settled into a leisurely tea time. With her long-awaited dream finally realized, Odette said goodbye to the alfresco cafe as the sun began its descent. Upon reaching City Hall, her agreed-upon rendezvous with her chauffeur, the entire metropolis had taken on a warm, rosy hue. Has Master Bastian already departed? Hans queried, his brow furrowed as he emerged from the sunny yellow convertible. Oh yes, he's got a tight schedule, Odette replied smoothly, concealing the truth. I see. And was everything to your satisfaction, ma'am? Odette answered with a beaming grin, as if her smile was a suit of armor to protect herself. Mrs. Clauswitz's joyful excursion came to a close with the clock tower ringing out the hour. With rats receding in the distance, Odette's vehicle raced down the road. It was a sultry late summer evening, and the shadows of objects were stretched out into the purple night. Bastian. Chapter 48, Wednesday when her husband come home. Thomas Muller let out a heavy sigh as he approached the young master. It's time for you to take a well-deserved break, my friend. You've been holed up here all weekend, so go home and get some proper rest. Bastian strode into his office with a smile on his face, his uniform from the Admiralty still fresh from a day's work. Despite the grueling workload he's faced since Monday, he radiated an uncharacteristic energy, his brisk pace belying any fatigue. Bastian placed his hat on the desk and pivoted to face Thomas. It seems like it's the director who could use a break. Are you trying to be humorous? Thomas replied, arching an eyebrow. You didn't tell my grandfather that, Bastian countered. Because he was a far better man than his grandson, Thomas shot back. The complaint that was previously on his lips dissolved into a fit of helpless laughter. Carl Illis was by no means an easy boss, he had a fiery temperament and bull-like stubbornness, but at least he was more compassionate than his grandson. He wasn't alone in thinking that. Everyone who worked for this family did. That is the ultimate praise, Bastian said as he slowly lifted his closed lids and rang the call bell. A secretary soon entered, carrying a steaming cup of robust coffee. Thomas watched Bastian savor his coffee, his gaze growing introspective. It's all winding down now. No need to hurry. Fake mines. Bonds and stock are reduced to paper crumbs. Ghost businesses dressed as golden egg-laying geese. Nearing completion was the Jeff Clauswitz capture trap. Finding a good location and setting the bait were the only remaining tasks. Let's strive to complete it as swiftly as we can. Bastian replied resolutely, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. At first glance, his face appeared to be that of a stern priest, perhaps due to the color of his uniform that bore a striking resemblance to religious attire. It's not as if it's going to end anytime soon. It will take time to fully engage them. It's all about being patient. I understand, Bastian interjected with a polite smile. It doesn't matter how many years it takes. It's not difficult to wait for a predetermined conclusion. But I don't think we need to be bogged down with this task for too long. Don't you agree? Is there anything in particular that leads you to believe that? Thomas asked. Bastian placed his half-empty cup down calmly. I'm planning to relocate to Ardennes this week, so I need to wrap up all my pressing matters before then. As they spoke, the sunset reached its peak and painted the office a brilliant shade of red. He made every effort to put off the joining until the day of his departure for the frontier, but it was becoming increasingly impossible to keep to that schedule because of Crown Prince Belov's unanticipated factor. On the day he was unexpectedly summoned to the imperial palace, the emperor himself broke the news. Crown Prince Belov, who is heading a delegation on a state visit to Berg, has expressed his desire to attend the simultaneous naval festival. The prince offered a credible excuse of checking in on allies, but the true intention was unmistakable. It was evident that they sought to verify the legitimacy of the scandal that had made headlines beyond their borders. This meant that Bastian and Odette had to put on a flawless display as a couple. It was, of course, what the emperor desired as well. Thomas Moeller, lost in thought, posed a question. It's not ideal for newlyweds to be separated like this, but this arrangement is somewhat unconventional. Perhaps it would be better for Mrs. Clauswitz to temporarily reside in Rats? If the listing issue gets resolved, I won't have much difficulty staying in Ardennes and handling the business, Bastian stated nonchalantly, shrugging his shoulders. I have no qualms in trusting my wife with a task that falls within my jurisdiction. Obviously, Thomas had a point. He didn't have to be in such a rush because there was still plenty of time before Crown Prince Belov's arrival. Bastian was fully aware that after stabilizing the business, it would be sufficient to move through with the merger. It was a necessary step in the end. Bastian gazed down at the phone on the desk. He had lingered in front of it for an extended period the day he impulsively made a decision. It was during the sunset hour, much like now, on the evening he returned from the imperial palace. Yet, Bastian simply stared at the phone, not daring to pick it up. Bastian didn't have to explain anything to Odette or ask her for her understanding. The phone's late-night quiet made this clear and confirmed that she felt the same way. Bastian steeled his emotions as soon as he realized their connection was only a business arrangement. There was no reason why they couldn't live together if it was only a business relationship. This would increase the emperor's confidence and increase the value of the deal. That was a choice that would be beneficial to Odette as well. I thought you were opposed to this marriage. Despite the light-hearted laughter, Thomas's gaze was piercing as he gazed at Bastian. Turns out you're a much better husband than I anticipated. Bastian nonchalantly unbuttoned his uniform as he quipped, you have a noble bride, so why shouldn't you? The interplay of light and shadow accentuated the sharp contours of his face, adding an air of mystery to his appearance. But your wife is a stunning woman, Thomas said, before retracting his statement. Leaving on his device, Bastian removed his shirt and jacket one by one and walked up to the wash basin. His consciousness was much clearer after he washed his face with cold water. While it was insufficient for him to completely overcome his accumulated exhaustion, it was plenty for the remainder of the work being done. He changed into fresh attire and tidied his disheveled hair. He meticulously arranged the uniform he had removed, a habit ingrained from his extensive military service. With his tie in place, he retrieved his jacket from the back of his chair and made his way out of the office. As he entered the elongated hallway leading to the conference room, the memory of the woman who had been endlessly awaiting his return surfaced in his mind. Odette remained in the fading summer sunlight, and he could easily picture her from that day. The expression on her face that resembled that of an abandoned kid when she first spotted him in the moving car, and the vacant stare in her eyes. The carefree passage of the urban landscape and the hemline of her yellow dress fluttered in the wind. The reason why the incident was so vividly etched was presumably due to its exceptionality. It was surprising that a woman who normally exuded calm and style would display such intensity. Maybe it was an illusion brought on by a misrepresented memory. With a shake of his head, Bastian strode confidently down the sun-drenched corridor. There was no use in speculating. It was more prudent to complete the task at hand and lay his eyes on the woman himself. With only 3 days left, Bastian estimated the amount of time left and again fussed over his tie knot. His plan abruptly changed as he walked up to the conference room door where the board members were waiting with eagerness. Possibly 2 days. That appeared to be plenty. Middle. Odette was rehearsing a challenging tune on the piano in the solarium when she heard that Bastian had arrived. It was a tired afternoon, and she was having trouble understanding the difficult composition. "What day is it today?" Odette asked, attempting to mask her bewilderment. "It's Wednesday, ma'am," the maid replied, looking quite puzzled. Odette nodded, confirming that her recollection was accurate, but this only deepened her confusion. She didn't understand how a man who hadn't even arrived on the promised weekend had shown up here on a Wednesday. Was it the sun, which was incredibly clear and bright? She felt like she was dreaming oddly. "If I may be so bold, shouldn't you go see the master as soon as possible?" Dora offered her cautious advice, clearing her throat. Only then did Odette snap out of her daze and hastily rise from the piano. Upon entering the grand foyer of the mansion, she realized that she was not appropriately dressed. She stopped in the middle of adjusting her hair, which had been braided like a child's, when Lovis walked up to her. She was startled by the sound of an unknown voice, and it took her a second to identify the elderly guy who was bowing profoundly in her presence. "Hello, Lovis. It's been a while," Odette greeted him. Fortunately, Odette recalled that Lovis served as the household's butler. He had made a brief stopover during the wedding week before going back to Rats to help Bastian, as she remembered. Behind him were the other servants, who bowed in unison. Everyone who was still working at the Rats townhouse had relocated there. Odette made an effort to comprehend what that reality meant. No. She was actually aware of the answer. She was simply not prepared to accept it. The elderly butler observed as Odette glanced around the hallway. "The master has already gone up to the bedroom." Odette's eyes widened in shock as she looked up at the magnificent central staircase in the hallway. Bastian had changed from the kind guest he had been pretending to be. He appeared to be claiming his ownership of the gorgeous mansion as the rightful owner. With each step up the staircase, Odette struggled to keep her nerves from unraveling, determined to maintain a sense of composure. However, her heart refused to cooperate, beating erratically as she approached the 3rd floor where the couple's bedroom was situated. It was as if her anxiety was betraying her, threatening to expose her unease at any moment. "No, ma'am, not that room." She heard another strange voice as she unlocked Bastian's bedroom door. Young attendant who was most likely from Rats. "The master is there," was said. The attendant made a courteous gesture, pointing to Odette's bedroom. "Why on earth?" Odette unlocked her room's door with a shaky hand as she was overcome by a nagging dread. Bastian stood before the window, gazing out at the sea as waves of white light danced around him, creating an ethereal aura. Odette steeled herself and crossed the threshold into the bedroom, taking a deep breath. As the door clicked shut, Bastian slowly turned to face her. Despite the gravity of the situation, his demeanor was oddly composed, his head slightly bowed and hands clasped behind his back. But there was also an air of arrogance about him, a quality that seemed out of character for the person who had committed such a heinous act. Like a tempest suppressed within her, Odette initially responded to Bastian's presence with a courteous facade. However, as she lifted her head to meet his gaze, the full weight of reality came crashing down upon her, threatening to overwhelm her. It was as though the turbulent emotions she had been holding back had been unleashed all at once. Her mind wandered back to the Wednesday her husband had arrived, the sea sparkling in the distance under a clear, mild sky that bridged the gap between summer and fall. Bastian. Chapter 49. The Changing Seasons. The lethargy that had been nagging at Bastian all day seemed to intensify as he got out of the shower. He was too exhausted to care over his messy, damp hair as he ran his fingers through it while wearing a bathrobe that was only lightly buttoned. He couldn't remember the last time he had gotten a good night's sleep. Bastian had been pushing himself relentlessly to complete his work well ahead of schedule. Day after day, he soldiered on, taking brief naps whenever overwhelming drowsiness threatened to overtake him, consuming perfunctory meals, and then diving straight back into work. With his eyes half shut and his steps faltering, he shuffled towards his wife's bedroom door. Though it was only 9 o'clock, he longed for rest today. Collapsing onto the bed with a bone-weary sigh, he appeared to be capable of sleeping for several days in a row in a deathly sleep. Bastian moved towards the corridor that connected the two rooms with a firm step. All that was left to do was wait for his father to take the bait after he had carefully constructed a lure. Final touches were being made to the preparations for the impending naval event. With just one mission left to accomplish, Bastian knew that he had to execute the perfect portrayal of newlyweds in love. This was precisely why he had agreed to Admiral Demel's offer of a honeymoon vacation, despite the web of lies that would inevitably ensnare him. Deceiving the ever-suspicious Crown Prince of Belov would require a complex and intricate fabrication, but it was the only way to capitalize on the freedom he had worked so hard to secure. He finally reached the end of the dimly lighted hallway and gently knocked on Odette's door. His wet hair was making a lovely pitter-patter sound as it fell onto the bridge of his nose, mixing in with her response. "Please, come in." Odette's voice was melodic and serene, utterly devoid of surprise or suspicion. Bastian pushed the door open with a hand that had hastily wiped away the droplets of water from his face. Odette was standing by the window, her figure bathed in the warm glow of the light that filtered into the room. The soft radiance lent a rosy tint to her pale complexion, making her appear all the more delicate and beautiful. "What are you planning to say?" Odette asked, wrapping a delicate lace shawl around her slender shoulders. "Nothing," Bastian responded, his answer catching her off guard. He crossed the room with heavy steps, his eyes heavy and bloodshot from exhaustion, even more so than they had been at dinner. His movements were sluggish and lethargic, a marked departure from his usual grace and poise. "What brings you here then?" Odette struggled to maintain her composure, fighting to keep her emotions at bay. But with just one word, Bastian shattered the steely facade that she had erected around herself. "To rest." Bastian walked over to the bed, and Odette's eyes widened as she realized the implications of his actions. "You don't mean that we're supposed to share the same bed? Why bother asking when you already know the answer?" Not wasting a moment as he clambered onto the bed and settled himself against the head cushion, his eyes fixed firmly on Odette. I don't understand," Odette protested, her face stiff with apprehension. After taking a deep breath to steady herself, she continued in a calm and measured tone. "I realize that due to the Crown Prince Belov's visit, the day when we must live together has been moved up. It's essential for us to appear more affectionate and friendly towards each other. However," Bastian only revealed his actions to Odette after the fact. Although it was disrespectful of him to act without consulting her first, she chose not to voice her objection. It would be sheer folly to invite ridicule by harping on the niceties of marital decorum, especially when the contract had already been signed and sealed. Employee and employer, after all. Odette was determined to honor the boundaries that Bastian had set for their relationship. She refrained from prying into Sandrine's affairs and dutifully complied with any unilateral directives that came her way. "However?" Bastian murmured, his voice low and strained with fatigue as he gently closed his eyes. To Odette's surprise, he seemed utterly spent, another startling fact that left her puzzled. "I'm happy to cooperate with you, Bastian, but is it really necessary?" Odette asked, offering her apologies as graciously as she could. "We've been using separate bedrooms for a while now, and there haven't been any disturbances or disruptions." Bastian opened his eyes just as the weight of the silence between them grew heavier. "What if an issue arises at the most crucial moment? Are you willing to take responsibility?" Odette paused for a moment. "Well, that's..." Bastian's gaze sharpened as he fixed his eyes on Odette, who found herself rendered speechless. There may already be rumors circulating about the Clauswitz couple living in separate quarters. They just haven't gained enough traction yet to surface in the open. Bastian leaned over to the bedside table and switched off the lamp, enveloping the room in darkness. The overwhelming weariness that had taken hold of him was now compounded by a throbbing headache, making him feel as though he were sinking into the depths of the ocean. Amidst the haze of his fatigue, the only clear image that he could discern was that of Odette standing in the faint glow of the moonlight. "But it's only natural for respectable couples to have separate bedrooms," Odette offered, after much contemplation. "I wouldn't know, being a bastard and all." With a heavy thud, Bastian collapsed onto the bed, engulfed in the soft, sweet fragrance of Odette's body. Who's to say that the grandson of an antique dealer can't be just as noble as you? Odette's eyes flickered uncertainly at his lightly joke. I didn't mean it like that. It's just that. Let's continue this discussion tomorrow, Odette, Bastian interrupted, letting out a long, tired sigh and closing his eyes. He had reached his limit, and he knew that he was in no state to handle Odette's wrath. I can't quite hear you now, he murmured softly, already half asleep. We'll pick up where we left off tomorrow. Bastian? Odette's voice called out his name, growing steadily closer. Despite his efforts to rouse himself, Bastian found that his body was no longer under the control of his consciousness. One step, then another. As the sound of approaching footsteps came to a halt, he felt a gentle hand shaking his shoulder with delicate care. That was the last thing that Bastian could recall from that fateful night. Middle. Duke Diessen's eyes flicked open, without so much as a twitch of movement. The caregiver returned to the hospital room just in time, only to be startled by the sight of the Duke's open eyes. Taken aback, he stepped back, causing the sound of a clattering tray and clinking cups to reverberate through the stillness of the night. In that moment, Duke Diessen remained motionless, his gaze fixed unblinkingly on the ceiling overhead. All right then. It couldn't have been a dream, Duke Diessen muttered to himself, chuckling softly before suddenly turning his gaze towards the caregiver. Raise me up immediately. A flash of anger crossed his face, causing his previous smile to vanish in an instant. Taken aback, the caregiver quickly raised Duke Diessen and helped him to sit upright. I knew my memory wasn't failing me. That girl is the one who did this to me. Duke Diessen ranted, talking nonsense and causing a ruckus. With a quiet, resigned sigh, the caregiver took a step back. It was the same commotion every single day, so there was nothing new about it. No one would have bothered to attend to the notorious patient had it not been for the generous compensation provided by his son-in-law. Did you have a nightmare? Would you like me to get you a sedative? The caregiver offered up formal words of comfort, albeit with some reluctance. In the past, the Duke had been known to become even more angry and vicious in response to such inquiries, often resorting to profanity-laced outbursts. However, on this particular occasion, he seemed to be quieter than usual. Bring me pen and paper, quickly. Duke Diessen barked out the order, running his frustrated hand through his disheveled hair. With a weary sigh, the caregiver quickly complied with the Duke's demand. As soon as the table with writing tools and paper was placed before him, Duke Diessen pounced upon it like a famished predator, his bloodshot eyes glittering with a manic intensity. In that moment, it was as if he had been transformed into a raving lunatic. Unconcerned with the caregiver's departure, Duke Diessen poured all of his energy into crafting his letter, his focus unbreakable. Tira. That damn bastard, Duke Diessen muttered through heavy breaths as he tightened his grip on the pen. What had occurred that day was far from a mere accident, and the final pieces of his fragmented memory had now fallen into place. He could recall with vivid clarity the feeling of Tira's hand shoving him with force, as well as the fact that Odette had been present on the stairs and had witnessed the entire scene. Despite this, both girls had kept their mouths firmly shut. With dry, chapped lips, Duke Diessen set about penning a letter seething with resentment and bitterness towards Tira. It was absolutely unimaginable that Tira and Odette could have planned a plot together. Since none of them have the strength necessary to carry out such a scheme, it was obvious that a third person must have provided them with aid. The most likely suspect was none other than the lowly grandson of the antique dealer, the man who had the nerve to marry Odette. Yes, that had to be it. Duke Diessen was certain of it. As he gazed down at his immobilized leg, a wave of agony twisted his features into a mask of terrible pain. Right after the accident had occurred, the man had wasted no time in proposing to Odette. To Duke Diessen's dismay, she had accepted without hesitation, as if she had been anticipating the offer. He had later learned that Tira was attending a prestigious girls' school, while Odette was enjoying a life of luxury on the man's dime. It had been a perfect, happy ending for everyone involved, except for Duke Diessen himself, who remained confined to the hospital, tormented by his thoughts and suspicions. He was convinced that the trio of bastards had played a part in his downfall, but he couldn't understand why the pieces of his memory hadn't fallen into place sooner. Duke Diessen surveyed the room with a sense of apprehension, acutely aware of how much of his waking hours over the past few months had been spent under the influence of various drugs. What other secrets and conspiracies might be lurking in the shadows? He knew that he needed to see Odette immediately, and the mere thought of her stirred a fierce determination within him. His hand trembled with a potent mixture of anger and adrenaline as he began to write frantically, the sound of the nib scratching against paper echoing through the stillness of the night. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. The gentle warmth of the sunlight creeping over the edge of the bed roused Odette from her slumber, signaling the start of a morning unlike any other. As she lay on her back, gazing up at the ceiling, her eyes were immediately drawn to the lazily swaying shadow cast by the shifting light. The sunlight filtering in through the window felt noticeably softer than it had just a few weeks before, a subtle reminder that the seasons were beginning to shift once again. The crispness of the blanket and the pleasant warmth it provided were also telltale signs of the impending change. As Odette lay there, taking in the fading sunlight and contemplating the arrival of autumn, she thought about the events of the previous night. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she closed her eyes, the memories still fresh in her mind. Bastian. The sound of her own voice, calling out the name echoed through Odette's mind, jolting her awake from her drowsy state. But as she came to her senses, the sound of laughter filled her ears, causing her to wonder if it was all just a dream. Slowly, she turned her head to the side, hoping against hope that the warmth she felt beside her and the sense of someone's gaze upon her was real. For so long, the bed beside hers had remained empty and cold. Odette's eyes met Bastian's as he lounged on the bed, looking down at her. As she gazed into his piercing blue eyes, her mind began to clear, and memories of the previous night flooded back to her. She remembered watching him fall asleep in the bed he had claimed as his own, feeling a mixture of frustration and confusion. But now, as she lay next to him once again, she could only feel a sense of curiosity and longing. As Odette lay down next to Bastian, she felt uneasy and restless. She feared that her movements would disturb his slumber. After all, they had experienced the consequences of sleeping separately before, as seen during their stay at Demel's villa. Despite her despair, Odette resolved to endure and persevere through the night. However, to her surprise, she fell into a deep, restful sleep like never before. Odette's cheeks burned brighter as she caught a glimpse of Bastian's hand, rough and rugged yet gentle as it cradled her face. As he drew her gaze back to him, she fell for his piercing blue eyes. It was as if the world had faded into the background, leaving only the two of them in a moment frozen in time. Bastian chuckled, his laughter filling the air as Odette bowed courteously to him. Her appearance became even more unkempt as a result of his playful tugging on her hair, which only made her more endearing. It was a romantic moment that would have led anyone to believe that the couple was a blissful newlywed couple living the best of their lives, showered in love. "Are you ready, madam?" Bastian asked abruptly, his laughter subsiding. Odette nodded in response, feeling compelled to do so despite her unease. Bastian. Chapter 50, Real Honeymoon. The Captain Clauswitz and his wife's sizzling honeymoon rapidly became the talk of the mansion. The recognized discord theory was no longer valid. It all seemed fake and a lie. "I heard that last night they slept in the same bed?" Everyone's attention was on the common room when the head maid, a hostess's assistant, appeared. Dora sat down and poured herself a cup of tea rather than responding with a sigh. The immature maid's words added fuel to the already raging fire. "Is it true that they kissed in front of everyone? Only our young master would do such a thing in front of the servants. It seems their relationship is not as everyone assumed. The rumors of a reluctant marriage due to pregnancy and living in separate rooms were all false. Perhaps the young master really loves the madam?" Dora responded calmly while sipping her tea. "Otherwise, what other reason could there be?" Dora remained silent, but the chatter in the common room continued to escalate. She massaged her throbbing forehead and took a sip of her now cold tea. As Bastian settled into life in Erdene, he and Odette started each morning together. The first time their head maid caught a glimpse of them in the same bed, she nearly let out a scream of shock. She had never expected to see Bastian there. However, as the days passed, the sight became more routine and mundane. The intimacy between the man and woman who had spent the night together was unmistakable, yet they maintained their composure and grace. They appeared like any other sophisticated newlyweds, and it was startling to see that their once highly unconventional marriage was now becoming increasingly mundane and unremarkable, despite previously being the talk of the entire empire. The maid nervously paced around the common room and cautiously asked, "What if the master truly cares for the madam?" This was the same girl who was scolded for laughing at the hostess on her wedding day. Dora let out a deep sigh and touched her forehead as she replied, "If you wish to continue working here, please refrain from indulging in baseless speculation." The events of this morning were far from ordinary. They transformed Dora's previously nebulous foreboding into a concrete certainty. Despite the familiar chime of the hostess's call bell, Dora braced herself and ascended the stairs with 2 steaming cups of tea and a newspaper in tow. Dora focused intently on her duties, resisting the urge to pry into her master's personal affairs. Meanwhile, Bastian stirred from his slumber and flung open the window for a breath of fresh air. With his tousled robe haphazardly draped over his frame, he sauntered over to the table by the window where a pitcher of water sat. As he gazed upon his wife, time seemed to stand still, and he remained transfixed long after his glass was drained. It was as if he had become lost in the depths of his own contemplation. Dora hovered tentatively a few paces away, biding her time for the opportune moment. Though she could have easily offered her salutations and made her exit, something held her back from speaking too hastily. Before long, Bastian strode away, leaving Dora feeling both relieved and bewildered by the encounter. Her sense of disorientation only deepened as she pondered the cryptic exchange. Bastian strode confidently towards his wife's bedside, unwavering in his approach. Just as Odette set down her empty cup and raised her gaze, he drew near and lowered his head in a gesture of tenderness. Before she could fully grasp the significance of the moment, Bastian had already pressed his lips to her forehead in a gentle, fleeting kiss. Though the encounter was brief, its impact lingered in the air for long. Bastian lavished his wife with a tender kiss before retreating to the bathroom, following his usual routine. The loving exchange left Dora feeling almost guilty, as if she had witnessed a moment of unguarded intimacy between the newlyweds. It was a scene straight out of a fairy tale, a sweet and romantic moment that made her heart flutter with warmth. "I'm already out of the madam's line of sight," had maid Dora. "What should I do now?" The maid's voice trembled with anxiety, jolting Dora from her reverie. "Try not to worry too much. The mistress is unlikely to dwell on that incident any longer." Odette displayed an uncommon selflessness towards the servants who often sneered and snickered behind her back. It wasn't that she forgot their disdainful behavior, but rather that she chose not to dwell on it. Even after winning her husband's affection, Odette remained unchanged in her demeanor. As the daughter of a beggar princess, she had only been married to the master for a short while, yet Dora had already come to appreciate her refined and dignified nature, that her previous assumptions about Odette being a vulgar type proved themselves false. After consoling the anxious maid, Dora rose to attend to her duties. Just as she was about to depart, she caught sight of the young maid skulking out of the common room. "Molly, where are you off to?" "You still have work to do," Dora called out. "I'm just heading to the garden for a bit," Molly replied with a cheerful smile, her answer suggesting a carefree attitude. Despite being a recent addition to the staff, Molly was diligent in her work but tended to be idle and anxious during her free time. "Looks like you're trying to slack off again," Dora accused. "I'm not. I come from the countryside, and being surrounded by grass makes me feel better." "It's the truth, ma'am," Molly replied, her frustration evident. "I only wanted to get some fresh air while the mistress is practicing the piano. You know perfectly well that I work hard from dawn until dusk. When are you going to learn proper manners and stop with this burlesque business?" Dora scolded the young maid, but her nodding head conveyed a hint of kindness. Although being stubborn, the young maid was also intelligent, and with proper guidance, she could become a valuable senior servant. Like a young colt full of excitement, Molly bolted out of the common room. Dora followed, leaving behind strict instructions for the other servants to keep quiet about the master and his wife's private affairs. "Look at that. It's not like she's being idle." Glancing around nonchalantly, Dora's laughter erupted when she caught a glimpse of Molly through the window. The young maid was sprinting into the depths of the forest, already far away from the garden. With an intrigued expression, Dora followed the enchanting melody that echoed through the halls. It was as if the notes themselves were leading her towards the source of the music. She walked with a light step, feeling as though she was drawn to the solarium by some unseen force. Middle. Bastian remarked with affection that she was an unfailingly tenacious woman. As he followed the lovely piano melody that resounded through the corridor every day and saw Odette at the end of it, his conviction was reinforced. Bastian discreetly sat down on the edge of the chaise lounge as he approached the solarium, ready to take in the symphonic ambience that enveloped his wife. The all-glass room sticking out into the ocean appeared to be a tropical paradise when bathed in the brilliant sunlight. Odette was seated in the middle of the room, totally engrossed in playing the white piano and utterly ignorant of his presence. Odette labored non-stop from dawn until sunset, adhering to her own set of regulations with the high precision of a well-trained soldier. But unlike a soldier, she devoted herself wholeheartedly to each of the simple pleasures of reading, knitting, and playing the piano throughout the day. In stark contrast to the life of poverty she had experienced only a few months before, Odette's interests were a tribute to her noble character. She was grounded and real despite her newfound riches, so it would be unfair to dismiss her goals as simple showmanship or vanity. Bastian, on the other hand, was convinced of one thing even though he may not have fully understood the scope of Odette's desires. The hostess's duties remained consistent, and Odette was a dedicated worker, always attentive to the upkeep of the estate, even tasks that could have been delegated to the butler or head maid. Along with her commitment to her work, her status within high society was gradually solidifying, without requiring extravagant expenditures. As his wife practiced the piano, Bastian decided against announcing his presence and instead sat gently with his legs crossed. It appeared that something was not right when she began to look more and more serious. At some point, Odette ceased playing and fixed her gaze on the sheet music with a determined expression. Retrieving the pencil she had earlier left on the music stand, she made a mark on the score to highlight a challenging section, and then meticulously studied the notes. With each tap of her fingers on the piano rim, she diligently established the rhythm, approaching the task as if she were cracking a complex code. Bastian was awed by her stunning performance as she sang. Although other people might think her singing was just a dull hum, Bastian could hear her brilliance in every beautiful note. Just as the memory of the starry night washed over Bastian's mind, reminiscent of the Song of the Sea Witch, Odette turned her head slowly. The sudden sound of the pencil dropping in surprise was accompanied by her melodic voice calling out his name. It was as if every syllable was imbued with a musical resonance. "When did you come in?" Odette asked. Bastian gestured calmly towards the piano. "Please, keep going. It sounds lovely." After a brief moment of hesitation, Odette shook her head slightly and began to tidy up the sheet music. "Thank you for the compliment, but I am aware that I still have much to learn." "Do you really think so?" "Yes, it has been so long since I played the piano that my hands have become stiff." She finished arranging the sheet music and stood up from the piano. "When I become proficient enough to perform without feeling embarrassed, I will give you an official performance." Odette concluded the awkward conversation with empty pleasantries. Bastian simply nodded in response and stood up from his chair with a cool demeanor. "Did you complete your work successfully?" Odette broke the uncomfortable silence by changing the subject. Later, as she began to practice the piano, Bastian retreated to his study to tend to his business affairs. Being a dedicated workaholic, it was not difficult to keep track of his busy lifestyle. Bastian lightly tapped his chin, well, more or less. He took a step forward, causing the distance between them to narrow gradually, like the sound of waves drifting in through the window. However, just as the gap between them became close enough for their shadows to meet, the butler appeared. "The horses have arrived, master," Lovis informed him. "They are settling in their new paddock. Would you like to see it for yourself?" "Okay," Bastian replied absent-mindedly. Despite conversing with Lovis, his gaze was still fixed on Odette. It was apparent that he was not content with the embarrassing rumors that had already circulated throughout the mansion. Bastian abruptly wrapped his arms around Odette's waist. "Do you know how to ride a horse?" Although feeling breathless, Odette managed to maintain a smile on her face, pretending to be a loving wife. "A little bit," she replied briefly. The response sounded absurd to her, but it was the only answer she could give.